I went camping alone that weekend because I needed to clear my head. I picked a place deep inside the national forest, far away from any main road. It was a quiet area, mostly pine trees and a narrow dirt trail that followed a small stream. I parked my truck near a clearing and hiked about a mile until I found a flat area between the trees where I could set up my tent. There wasn't a single sign of anyone else around. No tire tracks, no footprints, no sounds except the faint rustle of wind through the trees. I pitched my tent, gathered some dry wood, and built a small fire. The evening was calm, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. I sat there for hours just listening to the woods, crickets, frogs near the stream, and sometimes the distant creak of branches. As it got dark, I noticed how thick the darkness became in the forest. My fire barely reached a few feet beyond my campsite. Everything past that was swallowed by black. I didn't plan on staying up late, but I couldn't sleep either. The night air was heavy and still, and every tiny sound felt louder than it should. Around midnight, I was lying inside my tent when I heard something that didn't fit with the usual forest sounds. It was faint at first, a slow, dragging noise, like someone walking through wet leaves. I thought maybe it was a deer, so I stayed still and listened. But the sound wasn't steady like an animal walking. It stopped and started, almost like whoever or whatever it was pausing every few seconds to listen too. I turned off my lantern and lay still, breathing as quietly as I could. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. The noise came closer, slow but getting nearer. I could hear sticks snapping under weight. I waited for it to pass, but then it just stopped completely. The forest went silent. Not even the crickets were chirping anymore. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever, then finally reached for my flashlight and shined it toward the tent wall. Nothing moved, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was standing just outside, watching me. After maybe 15 minutes, the normal sounds of the forest slowly came back. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear wandering around. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. Every few minutes I'd hear faint rustling or the wind shifting through the trees, and I'd jolt awake. When the sun finally started rising, the light looked almost unreal through the fog. I stepped out and looked around. The ground near my tent had fresh marks, small, uneven impressions in the soft dirt, like someone had shuffled around barefoot. They weren't shaped like normal footprints. They looked uneven, like whoever made them didn't lift their feet properly. I followed them a few yards until they disappeared into the brush. That's when I noticed something else. A torn piece of fabric hanging from a low branch, dark red, maybe from a shirt or jacket. It looked old, weathered, but not rotten. I spent the rest of the morning trying to shake it off. I packed my bag to go on a small hike, planning to follow the stream and loop back before dark. The trail was narrow and twisted through the woods. After about an hour, I found what looked like an old, half-buried fire ring near the water. It looked abandoned, covered in ash and surrounded by empty cans and broken bottles. I figured maybe hunters used to camp here years ago, but something about it bothered me. The cans weren't rusty enough to be that old. One of them still had a label that hadn't faded completely. I kept looking around and saw a small pile of blackened clothes near a tree trunk. It looked like someone had tried to burn them but gave up halfway. There were bits of melted plastic, maybe from a backpack strap or jacket zipper. I didn't touch anything, but I stood there for a long time just staring at that mess, wondering who had been there and why it looked like they tried to destroy their stuff. When I got back to my campsite later that afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My backpack wasn't where I left it. I always kept it leaning against a tree near my tent, but now it was lying on the other side of the clearing, half unzipped. I thought maybe an animal dragged it, but when I checked, nothing was torn. Everything inside was neatly laid out on the ground. Flashlight, knife, snacks, even my phone. It looked like someone had carefully gone through everything and placed it down in rows. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I started tearing my tent down fast, throwing everything into the back of my truck. The whole time I kept glancing at the tree line. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel eyes on me. Just as I was about to leave, I noticed something carved into one of the trees near where I had camped. It was deep, rough letters scraped into the bark, "Stay quiet." I drove out of there faster than I should have, barely staying on the dirt road. When I hit the main road, I finally looked at my phone. The battery was dead even though I hadn't used it since morning. I plugged it into my truck charger, and when it turned on, I noticed something strange. There were new photos in my camera roll. They were taken sometime during the night. The first few were just dark, blurry shots of the woods, probably from inside my tent. Then one photo made my whole body go cold. It was me, asleep in my sleeping bag, my face barely visible in the light from the dying campfire. Whoever took it must have been standing only a few feet away from my tent. The next one showed my backpack lying open on the ground, exactly how I found it. The last photo was the worst. It was taken at sunrise from somewhere in the trees, showing me standing by the stream looking at the footprints. I never went back to that forest. I still camp sometimes, but only at public sites where there are other people nearby. Every time I close my eyes in a tent now, I think about that picture, the one of me sleeping. Somewhere out there, someone had been close enough to take that shot, quiet enough that I never even woke up. And the part that keeps me up at night isn't that they were watching me. It's that they left me alive on purpose. It was the middle of September when I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in a quiet forest in northern Arkansas. I had been working non-stop for months and needed a break from everything. I packed my small tent, sleeping bag, a cooler of food, a flashlight, and some basic supplies. I didn't pick a popular campground. Instead, I drove down some old county roads until I found a trail that looked like it hadn't been used much in years. The grass was tall, the dirt uneven, and there were no signs of anyone else around. That was exactly what I wanted. No noise, no people, just a few nights of quiet under the trees. The drive itself took longer than I planned because the road was rough. Branches scraped along the side of my truck, and a few times I thought about turning back, but I kept going. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a creek. The ground was dry and flat, and I could hear nothing but the wind moving through the tall trees. I parked my truck close to the treeline, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent near the edge of the clearing. The air was warm during the day, but it started to cool off once the sun went down. I built a small fire and cooked a can of chili over it. The light from the fire danced on the trunks of the trees, and the sound of insects filled the night. It felt peaceful in a strange way, like the world outside that forest didn't exist anymore. I lay back in my folding chair, watching the fire crackle, thinking how nice it was to be completely alone. Around midnight, I decided to get some sleep. I put out most of the fire, leaving just a few glowing embers, and crawled into my tent. The night was silent except for the creek running softly nearby. I remember staring at the top of the tent for a while, thinking how dark it was outside, darker than I expected. I must have fallen asleep sometime after that. A noise woke me up later, though I wasn't sure what it was at first. It sounded like something snapping a stick not far away. I stayed still and listened. It was quiet again for maybe a minute. Then I heard another sound, a crunch of leaves. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like slow footsteps. My first thought was that it was an animal, a deer maybe, but something about it didn't sound right. It wasn't moving away from the camp. It was circling. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, shining the beam through the thin fabric of my tent. I couldn't see much outside, just shadows moving slightly as the light passed. I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out barefoot, holding the flashlight out in front of me. The air was colder now, and I could see my breath. I scanned the trees, the creek, the grass around the tent, but there was nothing. I stood there for a long time, listening, but whatever had been moving was gone. I tried to go back to sleep, but I kept hearing small sounds, like twigs snapping or leaves brushing against something. I told myself it was probably raccoons or some small animal looking for food. Still, I couldn't relax. Around 3 a.m., I got up again and put a few more pieces of wood on the fire. The warmth helped a little, but the feeling that I wasn't alone stayed in the back of my mind. The next morning, I saw something that made me uneasy. Near the edge of the clearing, about 30 feet from my tent, I found footprints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were bare and they looked fresh. The ground was soft enough that I could see the shape of toes clearly. They led from the woods toward the creek and then disappeared into the water. I crouched down and looked at them for a while, trying to figure out how old they might be, but the dew on the grass made it hard to tell. I walked up and down the creek a bit, looking for any sign of someone else camping nearby, but there were no tents, no fires, nothing. Just the sound of water and the smell of wet earth. I told myself maybe some hiker had passed through earlier that morning, but it still bothered me that I hadn't heard them leave. That night, I built a larger fire and sat closer to it. The forest felt heavier somehow. Every small sound made me turn my head. I kept glancing toward the creek, half expecting to see someone standing there. Around 10 p.m., I heard movement again, slow and deliberate, just like before. This time, it was closer to the truck. I turned off my lantern and listened. I could hear faint breathing, not animal breathing, human, deep and slow, like someone trying to stay quiet. My heartbeat was pounding in my chest. I didn't move. I kept my flashlight ready but didn't turn it on. After maybe 30 seconds, I heard a soft shuffle near the tent, then silence again. I finally clicked the light on and shined it around, but I didn't see anyone. I walked around the clearing, my hand shaking so much the light was bouncing everywhere. When I got to my truck, I noticed something that froze me. The handle of the driver's side door was wet. Not from rain, it hadn't rained, but like someone had grabbed it with a damp hand. I locked the doors and got back inside the tent, though sleeping was impossible. I sat upright most of the night, holding the flashlight, staring at the tent's fabric whenever I heard something. When the sun came up, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. As I was taking down the tent, I noticed more footprints, this time closer to where I had been sitting by the fire. They weren't from the day before. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, circling where I'd been sleeping. I loaded the last of my stuff into the truck and drove out without looking back. The whole drive, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see someone following me, but the road stayed empty. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and just sat there for a while, letting it all sink in. I never figured out who that was or why they were out there barefoot in the middle of the woods. Maybe it was some drifter, maybe someone hiding from something, or maybe someone who just liked watching campsites at night. All I know is that whoever it was, they had been close. So close that if I had stepped out of the tent a minute later that night, I might have seen their face. I haven't gone camping alone since then. Every time I think about that trip, I remember those footprints and the sound of slow breathing just outside the thin wall of my tent, and it still makes my skin crawl. I went camping alone in the middle of October, deep in a wooded area I found online that wasn't part of any official campground. It was about 20 miles from the nearest small town, hidden off an old dirt road that hadn't been used in years. The trees were thick and tall, packed so tightly that the sunlight barely touched the ground even during the day. I liked places like that, quiet, forgotten, away from people. I parked my car where the dirt road ended, loaded my backpack, tent, sleeping bag, and a small cooler, and started walking into the woods. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. The ground was soft with layers of fallen needles, and every step made a dull, muffled sound. I followed an old deer trail that twisted between trees until I found a small clearing surrounded by thick brush. It was perfect, hidden and flat, with enough space for my tent and a small fire. I set everything up before the sun went down, built a small fire ring out of stones, and gathered enough dead wood for the night. By the time the fire started to crackle, the sky was already a deep orange fading to purple. The wind picked up a bit, carrying that sharp cold smell that comes before full nightfall. As the darkness crept in, the woods turned into a different world. The fire's light only reached so far, and beyond that everything was black and still. The only sounds were the fire popping and every now and then, a small rustle from somewhere far off, probably animals moving through the brush. I ate a simple meal, warmed a can of soup over the fire, and tried to relax. But even though I'd camped alone before, this time something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a constant awareness, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just because I was alone in an unfamiliar place. Still, every few minutes I'd catch myself looking toward the dark tree line, staring at nothing. I heard what sounded like sticks snapping once, but when I turned my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing there. I went to check the perimeter of my camp anyway. The ground was soft and muddy in spots, but I didn't see any footprints or animal tracks. I returned to the fire and sat for a while, watching the flames twist and move until my eyes started to sting. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and laid there listening to the quiet. The night was cold, colder than I expected. My sleeping bag was thick, but I still felt the chill in my bones. Sometime around midnight, I woke up because I heard something outside. It wasn't loud, but it was close, like slow, deliberate footsteps on the wet ground. At first I thought maybe it was a deer or a raccoon. I held still and listened. The steps stopped, then after a few seconds, I heard another and another, like someone walking slowly around the edge of my camp. The fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. I couldn't see much through the tent fabric. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped a small part of the tent flap, and shined the light out. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and mist hanging low to the ground. I listened for a few more minutes before convincing myself it had to be an animal. I zipped the tent back up, but I didn't sleep. I just laid there, staring at the roof of the tent, hearing faint rustles now and then, like something brushing against branches. Around 2 in the morning, the woods went completely silent. Not even insects. That silence in the woods always feels wrong, like the air itself is waiting for something. Then I heard it again, the slow, crunching sound of footsteps, this time behind my tent. They stopped right outside, no more than a few feet away. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't move. After a minute that felt like forever, the footsteps started again, circling the tent slowly. I could hear the faint creak of leaves under each step. Then I saw it, the faintest shadow moving across the tent wall, blocking a bit of the dim moonlight. It was tall, human-shaped. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The shadow stopped again, right by the tent door. For a moment, everything froze. Then the shadow moved away, fading into the trees. I waited another 10 minutes before unzipping the tent just enough to peek out. The fire had gone completely out. I didn't see anyone. The woods were dead quiet. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching my flashlight and my small hatchet. Every little sound made me jump. When the first light of dawn came, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. The ground around the tent was damp and soft, perfect for showing prints. I walked in a slow circle around the camp, and that's when I saw them, clear footprints. Human ones, bare feet. The prints were all around the camp, circling it, coming close to the tent, then walking back toward the trees. The size looked like a man's, maybe mine or a bit bigger. I followed them for a few yards, but they disappeared into the brush where the ground turned to packed dirt. I packed up fast after that. My hands were shaking as I rolled up my sleeping bag and took down the tent. I could feel that same pressure in the air, that heavy stillness, like I wasn't alone. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I just grabbed everything and started hiking back toward where I'd left my car. The trail felt longer than before, and several times I thought I heard something behind me. Faint, matching my pace for a few seconds before fading away. When I finally reached the car, I threw my gear in the trunk and locked the doors. Before driving off, I sat there for a moment, catching my breath. The woods were quiet again, but that didn't make it better. I looked at the dirt road stretching out in front of me, and in the distance, between the trees, I thought I saw movement. Just a brief glimpse of someone stepping behind a trunk, tall, bare-chested, skin pale against the dark trees. I didn't wait to see more. I started the car and drove fast, bouncing over the rough road until I hit the paved highway. When I finally reached town, I stopped at a gas station to wash my face and get coffee. My reflection in the window looked drained, eyes sunken, skin pale. I told myself it was exhaustion, that maybe it was some lost hiker or drifter. But when I went to clean my boots before putting them in the trunk, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Next to the heel on the side of my boot, there was a perfect muddy handprint. Not a smudge, a full print like someone had grabbed it during the night while I slept. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I went camping alone in late September, in a quiet part of northern Arkansas, near the Ozark National Forest. I'd been there once before with a friend years ago and remembered it being peaceful. There were no official campgrounds where I went this time, just miles of thick trees, muddy creeks, and narrow dirt trails that cut deep into the woods. I wanted the kind of silence that only comes from being far away from everything. No traffic, no people, just the sound of wind and bugs and my own footsteps. The air was cool but not cold. I parked my truck off a small service road that looked barely used and carried my gear about half a mile into the woods. The ground was soft and uneven, covered with fallen leaves that crunched lightly under my boots. I found a clearing between tall trees where the grass was thin and dry, just enough space for my tent and a small fire. It felt secluded, quiet enough that I could hear water moving somewhere in the distance. I set up my tent before sunset. It was one of those small one-person dome tents, barely big enough to crawl into. I gathered some branches for a fire, built a small circle of rocks, and lit it as the sun dropped behind the trees. The orange light flickered across the trunks, and every once in a while, I'd hear something move out there. A squirrel or a bird fluttering away. It didn't bother me. That kind of noise was normal. After I ate, I sat on a log and watched the fire die down. The forest was getting darker by the minute. There was no moon that night, so once the fire burned low, the blackness around me became almost solid. It was so dark that I couldn't see past the edge of my own campsite. Even when I shined my flashlight, the beam hit nothing but endless trees, and the light seemed to stop short in the fog that had started to drift through. At first, I didn't think much of the fog, but after an hour, it thickened so much that the firelight felt dim and trapped, like I was sitting in a small glowing bubble in the middle of nowhere. I could hear the water again, maybe a creek, not too far off. Then there was another sound mixed in, something soft, steady, and out of rhythm with the forest. It wasn't footsteps exactly, more like dragging or scraping. It would come and go, faint at first, then stop. Every time I tried to focus on it, the sound would fade, replaced by the crackling of the fire or the buzzing of bugs. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it could have been an animal moving through the leaves or maybe a branch rubbing against another in the wind. But the air was still. After a while, I decided to lie down. I put out most of the fire, leaving just a small glow of embers, and zipped myself into my tent. I could still smell the smoke, the damp leaves, the faint scent of pine. I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the woods. The noises outside seemed louder now that I was inside. Every small crack or shuffle sounded closer. Then I heard that same dragging sound again. It was clearer this time, coming from the right side of my tent. Stopped, started again, and stopped. Something was definitely moving just beyond the thin layer of fabric that separated me from the forest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe for a few seconds. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the sound was too slow, too heavy for that. The dragging turned into short bursts of movement, like something was crawling or being pulled through the leaves. I could hear the faint scrape of what sounded like fabric brushing against the ground. It went on for a while, moving in small circles, stopping every few seconds. I wanted to look, but I was afraid that shining my flashlight might make whatever it was react. After a few minutes, the sound moved farther away. I waited, listening until I couldn't hear anything but crickets. I eventually dozed off, though my sleep was shallow and uneasy. I woke up in the middle of the night, freezing. The fire was completely out, and the inside of the tent felt damp from the fog. I reached for my flashlight and checked the time. It was just past 3 in the morning. The forest was dead quiet. Not a single sound. That kind of silence in the woods is unnatural. It's the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl because it feels like everything around you is holding its breath. I turned on the flashlight and pointed it toward the tent's fabric wall. The beam made the thin material glow pale yellow. I didn't see anything moving outside, but when I turned toward the front flap, I froze. There were long streaks of mud across the lower part of the tent. Thick lines, smeared in uneven patterns, as if something had been dragged right in front of it. I unzipped the flap slowly and looked outside. The fog had lifted a little, and the moonlight had come out just enough to see the ground. The dirt in front of my tent was disturbed, like someone had walked or crawled there. I could see what looked like handprints, uneven and deep, pressed into the mud, leading away into the trees. My stomach sank. It didn't look like animal tracks. It looked like a person had been there, on hands and knees crawling around my tent. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but the beam only reached so far. The forest swallowed the light. I stood there for a long time just listening. Then I heard it again, the dragging sound, but much farther away now, deeper into the woods. It was faint, like someone pulling something heavy across the ground. I didn't stay to find out what it was. I packed my sleeping bag, grabbed my flashlight, and left the tent behind. I moved quickly, following the faint trail back toward the service road. My boots were wet, and every step seemed too loud. The whole time, I felt like someone was behind me, matching my pace just far enough that I couldn't see them. Every time I stopped, the woods were silent again. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and started it up. As I turned onto the road, I looked back once, and in my rearview mirror, through the fading fog, I saw something pale near the trees. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, low to the ground, still and silent, as my headlights swept over it. I didn't go back for the tent. I kept driving until I reached the main highway. The next day, I told myself it was probably a hunter or some animal I didn't recognize. But the prints I saw weren't shaped like hooves or paws. They looked like hands, pressed deep into the mud, with drag marks between them, as if someone had been crawling in circles around my tent all night long. It was early October when I decided to go camping by myself for the weekend. I had been working long hours and just wanted some quiet time away from everything. No noise, no traffic, no people. I picked a spot deep inside a national forest about an hour and a half from town. It wasn't an official campground, just a clearing near a creek that I had marked on a map the previous year. The drive there was peaceful at first, passing through open roads and small farms, then narrowing into rough dirt trails lined with thick woods. The deeper I drove, the less I saw of anything man-made. The trees grew closer together, tall and dark, their branches heavy with leaves that blocked out most of the sunlight. When I finally parked near the clearing, I realized how quiet it was. No cars, no birds, just the faint rustling of wind through the trees and the soft movement of water from the creek nearby. I set up my tent, built a small fire, and cooked some food I had packed. Felt good at first, peaceful, almost too peaceful. The forest floor was covered with pine needles and dry leaves, and every step made a light crunching sound. The air was cool, and the smell of damp wood and earth was strong. After eating, I walked along the creek, just following it downstream. The water was clear and shallow, reflecting the dim orange glow of the sky as the sun started to go down. When it got dark, I returned to camp, sat by the fire, and listened to the small pops of burning wood. I could hear faint noises in the distance, like something moving slowly through the trees. I told myself it was probably just deer or raccoons. The forest tends to sound louder when you're alone. Still, I couldn't help but glance into the dark tree line every few minutes. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and turned off my flashlight. It was pitch black except for the faint light from the fire outside. I lay there for a long time listening. The forest was alive with small sounds. Leaves shifting, branches cracking, water moving. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard a heavier sound. It wasn't the small, light movement of an animal. It sounded like someone stepping carefully through the woods. One step, then another, then silence. I froze, holding my breath. The fire outside was dying down, and I could see faint shadows moving on the tent wall. My heart was pounding so loud that I could almost hear it in my ears. I waited, but the sound didn't come back. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just my imagination or maybe a large animal passing by. I eventually fell asleep but woke up again a few hours later. The fire was out, and the forest was completely dark. It took me a moment to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it again, slow footsteps, but this time they were closer. I could hear them circling the area where my tent was. Leaves crackling softly, faint shuffle. Whoever or whatever it was, they were moving quietly, almost carefully. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the fabric above me, afraid that even the sound of my breathing might give me away. The steps stopped right outside my tent. I could hear something brushing lightly against the outer fabric. My whole body went stiff. Then, after what felt like forever, the steps moved away again, fading into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, too scared to even unzip the tent. When it finally got light, I got out and looked around. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints I could clearly make out, no broken branches, nothing. I felt ridiculous for being so scared, but something deep inside me didn't feel right. I packed my bag early but decided to stay one more night since I had come all the way out there and didn't want to cut it short for what might have been nothing. That day, I went hiking further upstream, following the creek through narrow paths and thick brush. Around mid-afternoon, I came across what looked like an old camp. Just scraps of tarp, an old metal pot, and some burned logs from a fire that looked long cold. Everything was covered in leaves and dirt. It looked like it had been there for a long time. I felt uneasy being there, but I still looked around a bit. There was a piece of old rope tied between two trees, and a small pile of empty cans stacked neatly in one corner. It was strange, too organized for an abandoned site. When I got back to my own camp later that evening, something felt different. My tent flap was open. I was sure I had zipped it before leaving. I checked inside, and my sleeping bag had been moved. My food bag was unzipped too, though nothing was missing. It looked like someone had just looked through my stuff. That uneasy feeling turned into full alert. I decided not to stay another night, but it was already getting dark, and driving that trail at night was dangerous. So I told myself I'd keep the fire going all night and leave first thing in the morning. I built the fire bigger, sat close to it, and kept my flashlight and knife next to me. Hours passed. The woods were quiet again. Around 1 or 2 a.m., I started hearing that sound again. Soft steps somewhere out there, in the dark. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but the beam barely reached past the first few trees. I couldn't see anything. The steps stopped when I aimed the light. I sat there staring into the dark, every sense awake, waiting for another sound. After a long silence, I caught something faint at the edge of the firelight. Something white, low to the ground, like the corner of a shirt or cloth, half hidden behind a tree. I blinked hard, thinking I was imagining it. Then I heard a faint creak, like wood bending under pressure, coming from the direction of the creek. That was it for me. I grabbed my flashlight, shoved everything into my truck, and didn't bother packing properly. As I backed out of the clearing, my headlights caught something just for a second. It was a figure, someone standing between the trees near where I'd camped. They weren't moving, just standing perfectly still, half turned toward me. I could only see their outline before the trees swallowed them again as I drove off. I didn't stop driving until I reached the highway. The next day, when I finally calmed down, I checked online out of curiosity and found a post from a few months back. Someone had gone missing in that same area. They'd been camping alone too. Their car was found parked not far from where I'd been. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I know it wasn't my imagination. Someone had been moving around my camp. Someone had gone through my stuff. I'll never go camping alone again. Even now, when I think about that quiet forest and those slow, careful footsteps outside my tent, I still feel that same cold fear crawl up my spine. The kind that doesn't fade, even after you're safe. I went camping alone deep in the woods of northern Arkansas, in a place I picked out using satellite maps. It was a stretch of forest that ran for miles with no roads cutting through it, just old trails used by hunters years ago. I parked my truck as far as it could go down a dirt path and then hiked in for nearly 2 hours before I found a small clearing surrounded by thick pine trees. The ground was soft, covered in fallen needles, and the air smelled clean, cold, and damp. I set up my tent near a small stream that ran quietly behind a slope of mossy rocks. By evening, I had everything ready. Tent up, fire going, backpack hung on a tree branch to keep it off the ground. I remember the way the firelight bounced off the trunks around me, making them look alive, shifting and breathing in the dark. I cooked a can of beans, listened to the crackle of the wood, and felt that quiet that only happens when you're truly far from people. I didn't hear any cars or voices, only the occasional call of a bird and the distant creaking of trees swaying against each other. The first night went fine. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the water running over stones and the faint hiss of my fire dying down. It was cold enough that I could see my breath inside the tent. Around midnight, I woke up for no real reason. The forest was completely silent. I don't know what made me uneasy, but I remember lying there, feeling my heartbeat in my ears, staring at the faint outline of the tent roof in the dark. I told myself it was nothing, but I didn't fall back asleep until the sky began to lighten through the fabric. The next morning, I found boot prints near the stream. They weren't mine. The tread was different. Wider, deeper, and fresh, pressed into the damp mud only a few feet from where I had been sitting the night before. I looked around and didn't see anyone, but I got this crawling feeling under my skin, like I was being watched. I tried to convince myself that maybe a hunter had passed through early, though there were no sounds of gunshots anywhere nearby. I spent most of that day trying to relax. I gathered some dry wood, moved my fire ring closer to the tent, and boiled water from the stream. Around mid-afternoon, I hiked a bit farther up the hill behind my site, just to see if I could find any signs of animals or people. I saw some broken branches, footprints again, same kind, and what looked like an old campfire pit filled with wet ash. It didn't look new, but it wasn't old either. When I came back down, I noticed something that bothered me deeply. My backpack was moved. It had been hanging from a branch, and now it was sitting on the ground near the fire pit. Nothing was missing that I could tell, but everything was rearranged inside. The knife I kept in the side pocket was gone, though. That's when the fear really started to sink in. I didn't see anyone, but I knew for sure now that someone had been there while I was gone. As night came again, the woods started to feel different. The wind died completely, and the forest turned unnaturally quiet. I made the fire bigger than before, feeding it constantly. The light stretched far between the trees, but it only made the darkness beyond look heavier. I sat there for hours, listening for any movement, any twig snapping or branch cracking. Nothing, just silence that pressed down on everything. It must have been close to midnight when I first heard it. A faint sound of crunching leaves behind my tent, slow and steady. It wasn't an animal. It had weight to it, deliberate, like footsteps trying to stay quiet. I turned toward the sound, staring into the dark, but all I could see were shadows and trees. My chest tightened. I didn't move for minutes, hoping it would stop, but then I heard the sound again. Closer this time, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't have my knife. I had my hatchet near the fire, so I grabbed it and held it low, trying not to make noise. I stepped back from the tent and kept my eyes on the direction of the sound. The footsteps stopped again, and all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Then a soft rustle came from the opposite side, like something circling me. I felt panic start to rise, the kind that makes your hands shake even when you're trying to stay calm. I threw a piece of burning wood into the dark, hoping to scare off whatever it was. The stick landed with a hiss, lighting up a small patch of ground. For a split second, I saw the faint outline of something, a person, a shape standing completely still between two trees. I only saw the lower half of them before the firelight faded. No sound, no movement, just gone. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire until dawn, watching the woods and waiting for the light. As soon as it was bright enough to see clearly, I packed everything as fast as I could. When I went to check near where I thought I'd seen the person, I found more footprints. Deep ones, heading downhill toward the stream. I followed them for a bit and found a small spot where someone had been sitting or crouching, watching from behind a fallen log. There were empty cans, a torn sleeping bag, and scraps of food wrappers. Someone had been living out there, close to my camp, probably for days. I didn't stay to find out who. I hiked straight back to where I left my truck, constantly looking over my shoulder. Once I reached the dirt road, I finally let myself breathe. I drove until I hit the main highway and didn't stop until I was back home. Later that week, I checked a map again and realized something I hadn't known before. About half a mile from where I camped, there had been a missing person case 2 years earlier, a hunter who never came back. They never found him, only his tent and some of his things scattered near the stream. I don't know if the person I saw was connected to that, or if it was someone else living wild out there. But I keep thinking about those footprints near my tent and how they had walked right up behind where I was sleeping the first night. They were close enough to touch the tent wall if they wanted to. Every time I think about it, I imagine waking up just a minute earlier that night and seeing someone standing there, silent, watching. And I realized that if I hadn't left when I did, maybe I wouldn't have made it back at all. It was late October when I decided to go camping alone in a forest about 2 hours from where I lived. I wanted to get away for a weekend, just to clear my head. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, and everything in my life felt like noise. I packed simple stuff: a small tent, sleeping bag, folding chair, cooler with a few drinks, a hatchet, flashlight, a knife, and some snacks. Nothing fancy. I left my phone in the car when I arrived, wanting no distractions. The campsite wasn't an official one. It was just a clearing near a narrow dirt road that stretched deep into the woods. I had found it months earlier while driving around aimlessly one evening, and it felt private, hidden, and quiet. The air was dry that day, and the ground was covered in layers of brown leaves. I parked the car in a small clearing and walked a few minutes down a slope until I reached a flat spot surrounded by thick trees. Felt calm. You couldn't hear anything but the soft rustle of the wind in the branches. I set up my tent and small fire pit before sunset, feeling good about finally being away from everything. I made a small fire when it got dark and ate a can of beans, sitting there watching the flames dance. I could smell the wood smoke mixing with the cold night air. There was something peaceful about being completely alone. Around 10 p.m., the fire burned low, and I decided to go for a short walk with my flashlight. The woods were quiet, too quiet, and the beam of light felt weak against the darkness. I could see the mist starting to form between the trees. The ground crunched beneath my boots, and every few steps I stopped to listen, just out of habit. The forest had that heavy stillness that almost feels like it's waiting. I turned back after a few minutes because the silence was getting to me. When I got back to my tent, I put out the fire completely and crawled inside my sleeping bag. I must have fallen asleep fast because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. It was completely dark, and I could hear my own breathing inside the tent. Then I realized there was another sound outside. It was faint but steady, something like soft crunching in the leaves. Slow, careful steps. I held my breath and listened harder. It wasn't close yet, but it was moving. I thought it could be a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavier, more controlled. They weren't random like an animal's movements usually are. After a while, the sound stopped. I waited a few minutes before unzipping the tent just an inch to look outside. My eyes adjusted slowly. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, but not much else. Nothing moved. I stayed like that for a long time, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I zipped it shut and laid back down, but I didn't sleep. Every small sound made my body tense. Sometime after, I must have dozed off again, because when I woke up the second time, the sun was just starting to rise. Everything looked normal, but I noticed something strange about the ground around my tent. The leaves looked disturbed in patches, like someone had walked around during the night. There were faint footprints, not animal prints but shoe prints. I crouched down and studied them closely. They weren't mine. The tread was different and larger. I stood there for a while, feeling that slow wave of unease building in my stomach. Someone had been there, walking around my tent while I was sleeping. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it could have been some hiker or hunter who wandered by, but the area wasn't near any trail. I didn't see a single car on the dirt road when I arrived. Still, I tried to act normal. I made a small fire again, cooked breakfast, and pretended it didn't bother me. But it did. I kept glancing around at the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. By afternoon, the forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. I didn't hear a single bird. Even the wind had stopped. I started feeling like I should leave early, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to. I told myself I was overreacting. I tried fishing at a small creek nearby for a few hours. The air had turned colder, and the shadows stretched long between the trees. When I finally headed back to camp, I noticed something that froze me. My folding chair, which had been by the fire pit, was gone. It wasn't blown over or moved, it was gone completely. I looked around the area, thinking maybe I placed it somewhere else earlier, but it was nowhere. That's when I started to feel that tight, electric fear in my chest. Someone had been there again. I checked my car up the hill. The doors were still locked. Everything inside was untouched. I tried to calm myself down, but I knew something wasn't right. I packed up a few things from camp and kept my knife in my hand as the sun started going down. I told myself I'd sleep in the car that night instead. It was around 8 p.m. when I got into the car. I reclined the seat a little and wrapped a blanket around myself, trying to rest. The forest outside was pitch dark. I turned off the flashlight and sat in silence. About an hour later, I heard something again. Slow footsteps, this time up near the car. I froze completely. The crunching stopped just outside my window. I didn't dare move. I could feel my heart thumping in my throat. After a few seconds, there was a faint sound of metal scraping, like something brushing against the side of the car. I turned my head slightly and saw through the reflection of the glass. Just a faint movement, a shape. Someone was standing right there. I stayed perfectly still. The shape moved away slowly toward the woods again. I waited long after the sound faded before I started the car. The engine roared in the silence and startled even me. I didn't look around. I drove straight down the narrow dirt road, not caring about the bumps or branches scraping the sides. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, and even then I pulled over to breathe, shaking all over. The next morning, I went back with a ranger. I didn't want to, but I needed to see. The ranger didn't say much as we walked down to where I had camped. Most of my stuff was still there, the tent, cooler, sleeping bag. But the ground around it was a mess of footprints, clear shoe prints all around. The ranger looked at them and then at me. They were big, heavy, and there were more than one set. Maybe 2 or 3 different pairs. That's when it hit me that I hadn't been alone that night. I had been watched, probably from the woods, maybe even from the moment I arrived. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but the footprints were deep, circling the tent, the car, and leading off into the forest where the trees grew thick. I never camped alone again after that. Every sound at night now makes me tense up. I still think about how close they got, how they walked around quietly while I slept just a thin layer of fabric away. The chair was never found. The ranger said maybe someone passing through took it, but I knew better. Whoever was there didn't want the chair. They just wanted to let me know they were out there, watching, and that I had no idea how close they really were. It was late October when I decided to camp alone near a lake deep in the woods, far from any town or main road. I had been camping alone before, but never this far out. I wanted the quiet. I wanted to get away from everything. No people, no noise, no lights. Just trees, water, and the cold air of early fall. I drove my truck down a rough dirt road for about an hour before I found a small clearing near the edge of the lake. The ground was uneven, soft with layers of dead pine needles, and the water was completely still. The air smelled like wet wood and mud. I set up my small tent under a big pine tree, a few feet from the shore. The lake stretched out in front of me like a dark mirror, surrounded by thick forest on all sides. There were no sounds except the wind brushing through the trees and the occasional creak of branches. Even the birds were quiet. I unloaded my cooler, small propane stove, and sleeping bag, then gathered wood for a fire before it got dark. By the time the sun went down, everything around me turned a dull shade of gray, then black. The firelight reached only a few feet into the trees. I sat close to the flames, eating chili, watching the sparks rise into the darkness. It was peaceful in a strange way, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Later that night, maybe around 11, I heard something moving in the woods. It wasn't close, but it was steady. It sounded like footsteps, slow and heavy, crunching over dry leaves. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the steps had a rhythm to them, too, even like someone walking upright. I froze, holding my breath, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound stopped after a few seconds. I waited, but nothing happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I went into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to sleep. The ground was cold and uneven, and I kept waking up to small noises outside. Snapping twigs, soft rustling, the sound of water lapping against the shore. Every time I opened my eyes, I saw the faint orange flicker of my dying fire through the tent fabric. Sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't from a sound, it was from a smell. A strong, sour smell, like something rotting or spoiled. I thought maybe I had left food out, so I unzipped the tent and looked out. My fire was just glowing embers now, barely lighting the area. The air was still, but the smell was stronger. I shined my flashlight toward the picnic table where I had left some of my stuff. My food was there, untouched, but just beyond that, between the trees, I saw something pale. It looked like fabric, maybe a piece of clothing. I stepped out slowly, barefoot, and moved closer. The ground was freezing. When I got near the edge of the trees, I saw it wasn't fabric. It was a piece of plastic tarp, half buried under dead leaves. I lifted a corner with a stick and saw a dark, damp stain underneath. The smell hit me so hard I gagged. It was the smell of decay. I dropped the stick and stepped back fast, heart pounding. I didn't know what to think. Could have been an animal carcass, but the shape under the tarp looked too solid, too big, and the edges of the tarp had been weighed down with rocks. Someone had put it there on purpose. I backed up toward my tent, flashlight shaking in my hand. The woods behind me suddenly felt alive, every sound louder than it should be. I packed fast, throwing everything into the truck, not caring where it landed. I just wanted to leave. As I was loading the last of my gear, I noticed something else. Tracks in the dirt near my tent. They weren't animal prints. They were boots, fresh ones, deep enough to be recent, maybe made within the last few hours. They led from the woods to my camp, circled the tent once, and then went back toward the trees. My stomach dropped. Someone had been here while I was sleeping. I climbed into my truck, slammed the door, and started it up. The sound of the engine was deafening after so many hours of silence. I turned on the headlights, lighting up the trees in front of me. For a second, I thought I saw movement. Something or someone slipping between the trunks, just out of reach of the light. I hit the gas and drove fast down the narrow path, the truck bouncing over roots and rocks. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely keep it straight. The road twisted through the woods, and the trees looked like walls closing in on both sides. Every time my headlights hit a branch or a stump, I thought it was a person. It took almost 40 minutes before I reached the main dirt road again. I didn't stop until I was miles away, parked under a flickering streetlight near a closed gas station. I sat there, breathing hard, staring at the dark forest behind me. In the morning, I drove to the nearest ranger station. I told them what I found, left out the parts about the footsteps, just said I had found something wrapped in a tarp near the lake. They sent a ranger out there later that day. A week later, I got a call back. They said it wasn't an animal. It was a man. They said he'd been dead for weeks, wrapped up and hidden under that tarp. There were signs someone had been camping nearby recently. Ashes from a fire, some torn clothes, and fresh boot prints. They asked if I had seen anyone, and I told them no. For days after that, I kept thinking about those footprints around my tent. Whoever killed that man had come back. Maybe they were watching me the whole time, waiting for me to fall asleep. Maybe they thought I had seen something. Maybe that's why they walked around my tent. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone anymore. I stay near other people in places where I can see headlights at night, where there's noise and light and movement. I can't forget how quiet it was out there. That kind of silence doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels like someone's waiting in it. And every time I close my eyes at night, I think about those boots circling my tent and the tarp just a few yards away. I can still smell that rotten air, and I still wonder how long they stood there in the dark, watching me sleep. It was late September when I decided to go camping alone for the weekend. I had a few days off work, and I wanted to get away from everything. No people, no noise, just quiet woods and open sky. I drove about 3 hours out from home and found a spot deep inside a forest reserve. It wasn't an official campsite, but it looked perfect. There was a small clearing with flat ground, surrounded by tall pine trees that blocked most of the wind. A narrow dirt path led to a creek about 50 yards away. Everything felt peaceful when I got there, just the sound of crickets and the slow trickle of water. I set up my tent around noon, built a small fire pit, and stacked some dry wood nearby. The smell of pine needles and damp soil filled the air. It felt good to be away from people. I spent the day walking around the creek, skipping stones, and taking pictures of animal tracks in the mud. The tracks looked fresh. Deer mostly, maybe raccoons too. I didn't think much about it. As the sun went down, I sat by the fire, ate some canned soup, and watched the woods fade into black. By the time I crawled into my tent, the air had turned cold. I zipped the tent shut, turned off my flashlight, and listened to the forest sounds. For a while, it was peaceful. I could hear the creek and some insects chirping. But sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why. Everything was quiet, too quiet. The forest usually has a constant buzz at night, but all of it had stopped. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. Just the faint rustle of leaves somewhere in the dark. I lay there trying to ignore it. I told myself animals move around at night all the time. But then I heard something, a crunch, like a footstep, came from behind my tent, slow and careful. Then another one, closer. My heart started beating hard. I froze and held my breath. Whatever it wasn't a small animal. It sounded heavy. The steps circled halfway around the tent, then stopped completely. I waited, staring at the tent wall, trying to see if a shadow would appear. But there was nothing. After a long silence, I finally grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the tent wall. The light lit up the thin fabric, showing the outline of pine branches swaying outside. But nothing else. I sat there, flashlight in hand, waiting. 5 minutes passed, maybe more. Then I heard another sound, this time farther away, down toward the creek. It was like something moving through the brush. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When morning came, I stepped out of the tent. The air was cold and foggy, and everything was damp. I looked around, trying to see if there were any tracks near my tent. The ground was covered with pine needles, so it was hard to tell, but near the edge of the clearing, I noticed something odd. There was a single boot print in the dirt near the creek path. It was too big to be mine. I wore size 10 hiking shoes, and this print was at least a size 12 or 13. I felt uneasy, but I told myself it could have been from someone who passed by days ago. The woods weren't private property, after all. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there that night. I spent the day trying to distract myself. I went fishing in the creek, cooked a small meal, and gathered more firewood. By sunset, the fog cleared, and the forest looked normal again. I convinced myself I'd been paranoid, that it was probably just a deer or maybe a stray hunter walking by in the dark. That night, I made a bigger fire to keep warm and feel safer. The flames lit up the trees around me, and the crackling sound drowned out the forest noises. I stayed up late watching the fire die down. When I finally crawled into the tent, I felt more relaxed. I fell asleep fast, But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke again. It was pitch dark. My fire had burned out completely. I couldn't see anything. At first, I thought it was the cold that woke me, but then I realized I could hear something again. Slow, deliberate footsteps. They were coming from the same direction as before, behind the tent. My stomach dropped. I held my breath, every muscle tense. The footsteps stopped right outside my tent, maybe 2 or 3 feet away. Then I heard a sound that made my skin crawl. It was the faint metal clink of something, like a knife hitting another piece of metal. I didn't move. My sleeping bag felt like a coffin. I wanted to unzip the tent and run, but I knew any noise might draw attention. I just lay there, frozen, staring at the tent wall. After maybe a minute, the sound stopped. Then the footsteps started again, this time walking slowly toward the creek. I waited another 5 minutes before I dared to move. When I finally unzipped the tent, I couldn't see anyone. The woods were dark and silent. My flashlight beam shook in my hand as I scanned the trees, the creek, the path. Nothing. I stayed up until sunrise, sitting by the cold ashes of my fire. When daylight came, I checked the area again. That's when I found something that made my stomach twist. Near the creek, where the sound had gone, there were more boot prints, fresh ones. But beside them, there was something else. A half-buried tin can, and next to it, a torn piece of fabric from a jacket. The fabric was wet, dirty, and ripped at the edges. It looked recent. I followed the prints a bit farther down the creek. About 50 yards from my tent, hidden behind a fallen tree, I found what looked like a small, half-collapsed shelter made from branches and a tarp. Inside were a few things: a sleeping bag, some empty food cans, and a plastic bottle. Someone had been living out there. I backed away slowly, not wanting to touch anything. My mind started racing. Whoever had been out there must have noticed my camp and come closer during the night. Maybe they were watching, maybe they were trying to take something, or maybe worse. I packed up my things as fast as I could, keeping my knife in my hand the entire time. By the time I started my truck, my hands were shaking. I didn't look back at the clearing. I just drove until I hit the main road again. I didn't even stop for gas until I was nearly out of the forest area. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't stop thinking about those footsteps, that metallic sound, and that hidden shelter. Someone had been living out there in the woods, watching, moving silently at night. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't my imagination. I never went camping alone again after that. A few weeks later, I read an article online about a man found living in the same forest. Someone who had been hiding out there for months, breaking into campsites at night, stealing food and supplies. He'd been arrested after a hiker caught him going through their tent while they slept. When I saw the photo of where they found him, it looked exactly like that spot by the creek. The same trees, the same fallen log. And it made sense then. The sound I heard, the boot prints, the metallic clinking. I'd been camped right next to his hiding spot, and he'd been there all along, watching me from the dark. I went camping deep in northern Arkansas one weekend in early October. The air had that sharp edge that comes right before real cold starts, and the forest was half orange, half bare. I didn't go with anyone. I just wanted a quiet few days away from everything. I'd done solo trips before, but this one felt different right from the start. I had picked a small lake far off the main road, surrounded by hills covered in trees that looked almost black once the sun started to drop. The place wasn't on any popular camping map. I found it online through some old hiking forum post from years ago, where someone mentioned it had clear water and no crowds. That's exactly what I wanted. I parked my truck at the end of a narrow dirt path that wound down toward the lake. The road looked like it hadn't seen any vehicles in a while. Twigs cracked under the tires, and the sides were thick with vines. I had to stop twice to move fallen branches out of the way. The whole time I didn't hear a single sound from any animal, not even birds. It was strange because that deep in the woods you usually hear life all around you. Crickets, frogs, woodpeckers, something. But it was just wind through the trees, faint and uneven, like someone quietly moving around far off. I reached a clearing right before sunset. The lake was small and still, with a thin fog hanging over the surface even though it wasn't cold enough for that yet. It had a glassy look, like it hadn't been touched in a long time. I found a flat spot near the water to set up my tent, just close enough to see the reflection of the trees, but far enough that the ground wasn't soft. I unpacked, built a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sky went dark, the forest behind me turned pitch black. I could barely see 10 feet beyond my firelight. For a while, everything was fine. I sat there listening to the crackle of the fire, feeling the quiet settle in heavier than I expected. Around 10, I decided to walk down to the water with my flashlight. The beam cut through the mist that was still sitting on the lake, and I saw something that made me stop. Across the water, maybe 50 yards away, there was a faint shimmer of light. It wasn't moving like a flashlight or fire, more like the reflection of something metallic catching the light. I thought maybe it was an old can, or something left behind. I scanned the trees, but the light was gone. Back at camp, I tried to shake it off. I'd been awake since dawn, so I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into the tent, zipped it shut, and listened to the soft ripple of the lake and the popping of the fire dying down outside. But just as I started to drift off, I heard something that made my heart jump. It was faint, but clear, the sound of something dragging over the ground. A slow scrape, like a heavy bag being pulled through dirt. It came from somewhere behind my tent, moving steadily closer, then stopping. I lay completely still, barely breathing. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. I waited, straining my ears, but all I heard was the faint lap of water against the shore. Then, after a minute or two, it started again, that dragging sound, now off to my left, like whoever or whatever it was had circled part of my campsite. It stopped again, and this time I heard another sound. A soft thud, followed by the faintest sound of breathing. Not loud, but human. I reached for the small hatchet I kept near the door of my tent, my hand shaking so much I almost dropped it. I didn't open the flap or make a sound. I just waited. After a few minutes, I heard quiet footsteps moving away, slow and steady, heading toward the trees. Then silence. I lay awake for hours, staring at the thin fabric walls of the tent, half expecting to see a shadow pass by. Nothing happened the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep at all. When the sun came up, the fog was still sitting low over the lake. The ground around the back of my tent looked disturbed, like someone had stepped there. I found a faint boot print in the soft dirt. Not mine. It wasn't fresh enough to tell much, but it hadn't been there when I set up camp. I tried to convince myself it was from some old hiker, but it didn't make sense. There hadn't been anyone out there for miles. I packed my gear up fast and decided to move to the other side of the lake, just to feel better about it. I hiked maybe half a mile along the shore, found another small clearing, and set up again. I spent most of the day fishing and trying not to think about the night before. Around sunset, I started gathering wood when I noticed something odd near the edge of the trees. It was a pile of small sticks, stacked neatly together, about knee-high. It looked too deliberate to be random. At first, I thought someone was marking a trail or something, but there were no markings, no signs of anyone camping nearby. I walked around it, and that's when I saw another one about 20 feet away, then another. 3 piles, each spaced evenly apart, all pointed toward the lake. Something about it set me on edge. I went back to my fire, trying to ignore it. As night came, I felt that same heavy quiet again, thicker than before. The air didn't move, not even the smallest breeze. I sat by the fire for hours, staring out into the dark. Around midnight, I heard a splash in the lake. Not small, like a fish, but deep and heavy, like someone stepping in. Then another, closer to the shore. I turned my flashlight toward the water, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something. A figure, knee-deep, facing the trees, not moving. I froze. The beam shook in my hand, and before I could focus again, it was gone. The water rippled once and went still. I didn't hear any running, no footsteps, nothing. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes before backing toward my tent, keeping the light on the lake. I didn't sleep again that night either. By morning, I made up my mind to leave. I started packing fast, barely even eating. As I rolled up my tent, I looked back toward the lake and froze. On the ground, right where I had been standing by the fire the night before, there was another small pile of sticks. Same shape, same height, and I knew it hadn't been there before. The dirt around it was damp, like someone had been standing there. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my pack, threw it into the truck, and drove out as fast as the narrow road would let me. When I finally reached the main highway, I stopped at a gas station miles away just to catch my breath. The man behind the counter asked where I'd come from, and when I told him the name of the lake, he looked at me for a second before saying nothing. That was 3 years ago. I haven't camped alone since. Sometimes when I close my eyes, I still see that still figure in the lake and the piles of sticks lined up pointing toward me. I don't know who was out there or what they were doing, but they weren't lost. They knew exactly where I was, and they were watching the whole time. I went camping alone one weekend in late September. The air had that cool, sharp feeling that comes right before the real cold of fall sets in. I'd planned to stay 2 nights near a lake deep in the woods, about 30 miles from the nearest small town. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing near the water that I'd found on a hiking trip a few years earlier. I liked that it was quiet. No signs, no paths, just forest, water, and silence. I packed light but enough to be comfortable. Tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, a cooler with food, and my old knife I always carried camping. I left my phone in the car after turning it off. I wanted peace, no distractions. It was late afternoon when I parked off the dirt road and hiked down to the lake. The trees were thick and tall, the kind that let in thin slices of sunlight through the gaps in their branches. The air smelled like wet leaves and pine. Every step I took crushed a layer of dry leaves, making that crisp sound that echoed faintly between the trunks. I could hear the faint rush of water from somewhere nearby, probably the stream that fed into the lake. When I reached the clearing, it looked just how I remembered it: flat ground near the lake, soft earth, and enough open space to set up camp without feeling crowded by trees. I pitched the tent, gathered a pile of dry sticks for the fire, and started boiling some water. Everything felt calm, steady, familiar. There was no wind, no bugs buzzing in my ears, just the occasional rustle of branches far away. I remember sitting there, eating, and thinking how good it felt to be that far away from everyone. The world felt smaller out there, quieter, almost clean. As the sun started to sink, the air cooled fast. The lake turned dark and still, like glass. I threw a few larger logs into the fire and watched the smoke drift straight up through the trees. After a while, I started hearing small sounds out in the woods, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. It wasn't unusual. There's always movement out there, probably raccoons or a deer passing through. But something about it made me notice. The sounds were slow, like someone stepping carefully, waiting between each step. I tried to ignore it and focused on the fire instead. When it got darker, I realized I couldn't hear any crickets. Usually, by that time of night, the woods come alive with noise, but it was silent. I sat there for a while longer, poking at the fire, listening to the quiet. Every now and then, I thought I could hear movement again, faint but close. A soft crunch here, a light step there. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but it felt different. It felt aware, like something was moving just enough to stay out of sight. I got up and aimed my flashlight toward the trees. The beam cut through the dark, but I didn't see anything, just trunks and undergrowth. I turned it slowly in a wide arc, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but when I switched the light off, I heard it again, the faintest sound of movement, like someone taking one slow step through the leaves. Then nothing. I stood there for a long time, listening. The fire popped behind me, and I could feel its warmth on my back, but my eyes were fixed on the tree line. After a while, the sounds stopped completely. I sat back down, keeping the flashlight on my lap. My heart was beating fast even though I was trying to stay calm. I decided I'd sleep inside the tent earlier than planned. I zipped it shut, turned off the light, and laid there listening to the fire crackle outside. For a long time, I couldn't sleep. Somewhere deep into the night, I woke up suddenly. It was still dark. The fire had burned down to faint orange coals, and everything was quiet. At first, I couldn't tell what had woken me up, but then I realized I could hear something. It was faint, but it was there, metal scraping on something solid. It sounded like a knife blade or something sharp being dragged across a hard surface. It came from somewhere near my gear outside the tent. The sound would stop, then start again, slow and steady. I froze completely still. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. The sound went on for a few minutes, then stopped. After a long silence, I heard something else. A slow, heavy step near the tent. The ground barely crunched, but it was enough to know it wasn't an animal. The steps were too deliberate, too slow. I didn't move or breathe. My mind was racing. I had no idea what to do. I didn't want to unzip the tent and make noise, but I also couldn't just lay there if someone was outside. The steps moved around the tent, circling once, then stopped near the back. I waited for what felt like an hour, though it was probably just a few minutes. Then finally silence. No more movement. I stayed awake the rest of the night, barely breathing, until the first faint light started to show through the fabric of the tent. When I finally stepped out, everything looked normal. My fire was out. My gear was still there, but I noticed my cooler had been moved about 2 feet from where I'd left it. The lid was open, and inside my food was gone. Even the packaging was gone. There were no animal tracks around it, no torn plastic, no mess. Just gone. And on the side of the cooler, I saw deep, thin scratches, like someone had used a blade to pry it open. I scanned the ground around my camp. The dirt was disturbed near the trees, faint boot prints leading toward the woods. They weren't mine. They were wider and longer. Someone had been out there during the night, moving quietly, close enough to touch my things. The thought of how close they'd been made my stomach twist. I packed up as fast as I could. Every sound in the woods made me jump. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. When I hiked back up to my car, I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. When I reached the car, I noticed something else. On the passenger side door, near the handle, there was a fresh scratch. It looked like someone had dragged a knife or a key across the paint. A long, shallow line from front to back. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The forest looked still and empty, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like something was watching from between the trees. The drive out was rough, bouncing over roots and stones, but I didn't stop until I hit the main road again. When I finally saw another car, I felt like I could breathe again. I never went back to that lake. I thought maybe it was just a hunter or some stranger living off the grid, someone passing through. But there was something about the way they moved, the way they took their time, the way they circled the tent without ever saying anything. It didn't feel random. It felt like they were studying me, waiting to see what I'd do. For weeks after, I kept thinking about that sound. The slow scrape of metal in the dark, just a few feet away from where I was sleeping. I stopped camping alone after that, because it wasn't the woods that scared me. It was realizing how close someone had been all night, quiet, patient, and waiting. It was late September when I decided to go camping alone for a weekend. I'd been working non-stop for months, barely sleeping, barely getting outside. I needed to get away from everything. Phones, people, noise. I picked a small spot near a lake about an hour's drive from where I lived, surrounded by woods thick enough that you couldn't see 10 feet in front of you once the sun went down. The place wasn't an official campground, just a clearing someone had used before. You could still see old fire rings made from blackened stones, and crushed grass where tents must have been pitched long ago. It looked perfect. I got there a little before noon. The drive-in was rough. A narrow dirt path twisting through pine and oak, branches brushing the sides of my car the whole way. The air smelled like sap and damp soil. When I stepped out, everything was quiet except for the wind moving through the trees. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to set up the tent, unroll my sleeping bag, and stack some firewood I'd brought. I wasn't in a hurry. I wanted to stretch out the piece of it. By late afternoon, I had a small fire going and was sitting by it, staring out at the lake. The surface was flat, like glass, reflecting the trees and sky. Not a single ripple. I watched a hawk circle above the water, dipping low a few times, probably chasing fish. The only sounds were the occasional creak of branches and the soft crackle of my fire. It was calm, almost too calm, the kind of stillness that makes every little sound seem louder than it really is. As the sun started to drop, I cooked some canned food on the fire. The air grew colder, the kind of cold that feels sharper out in the woods. I wrapped myself in a jacket and sat watching the fire fade from yellow to orange to deep red. It was getting dark fast, and I could see my breath now. I added a few logs and listened. Somewhere out there, maybe half a mile away, I thought I heard something moving, something heavy, stepping over dry leaves. It was faint, like a dull crunch every few seconds. I figured it was just an animal, probably a deer, maybe a boar. The sound faded after a while, and I didn't think much about it. When night fully settled in, the darkness was thick, almost pressing. The trees looked like black pillars all around me, and the lake was just a dark sheet with a faint shimmer from the moon. I turned off my flashlight to test how dark it really was, and instantly I couldn't see anything. Just the firelight flickering weakly, throwing shadows that seemed to move on their own. The quiet was deeper now, not even crickets. I tried to relax, sitting there by the fire, but I started feeling watched. It wasn't something I could prove, just this heavy sense that someone, or something, was out there, standing still and watching me. I told myself it was nerves. I'd never camped alone before. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. Every time I looked toward the trees, I half expected to see a figure between them. I didn't, but the thought stayed with me. Around midnight, I decided to go to sleep. I put out most of the fire, leaving a few glowing embers for warmth, then crawled into the tent. The ground was cold and hard. I lay there listening to the faint crackle outside and the occasional drip of water from tree branches. For a while, everything was fine. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. It was a low snapping noise, like someone stepping on a stick. Then another, then silence. My body froze instantly. The sound came from just outside the tent, maybe a few feet away. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, slow and careful, like someone trying not to make noise. I lay there completely still, barely breathing, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I thought maybe it was an animal again, but something about the rhythm of the steps felt different, too deliberate. I waited, staring at the thin wall of fabric between me and whatever was outside. After what felt like minutes, I heard another sound, a slow dragging across the ground. It wasn't walking now. It was moving differently, lower, almost like crawling. I clenched my hands into fists and stared at the zipper of the tent, half expecting it to move. Didn't. The sound stopped completely after a while, but I couldn't fall back asleep. I just lay there, listening, waiting for something else. Eventually, I sat up and checked my watch. It was 3:12 a.m. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could and looked outside. The fire was almost dead, just faint red coals glowing. The woods looked empty, but the silence was heavy again, that same strange stillness from earlier. I turned on my flashlight and swept it around slowly. The beam caught the trees, the bushes, the lake. My car parked a little way off. Nothing seemed out of place. But when I turned the light toward the edge of the clearing, I saw something that froze me solid. There were footprints, fresh ones, pressed deep into the soft ground. They were boot prints, human, large, spaced unevenly, like whoever made them had been moving slowly, maybe crouching. They circled my campsite, looping close to the tent before heading off toward the trees. My throat went dry. Someone had been walking around my camp while I was asleep. I scanned the woods again, but the flashlight's beam didn't reach far. Every shadow looked like a person. I didn't know what to do. If someone was still out there watching me, I didn't want to alert them by running for the car, but staying didn't feel safe either. My brain kept jumping between choices: stay, go, hide. In the end, I grabbed my backpack, shoved everything important into it, and started walking slowly toward my car. My heart was hammering the whole time. Every step sounded too loud. When I reached the car, I got in fast and locked the doors. The forest around me looked endless and hollow. I sat there for a few minutes, gripping the steering wheel, staring at the dark woods through the windshield. I thought I saw something move once, just a faint flicker between the trees, but it could have been my imagination. I started the engine quietly and turned the headlights on low. That's when I saw it. About 30 feet ahead, at the edge of the light, there was a figure standing still. It wasn't close enough for me to see the face, but I could see the shape. A tall man standing halfway behind a tree, not moving, just standing there watching. My stomach twisted. I pressed the gas pedal without thinking, and the car lurched forward, headlights bouncing across the dirt path. When I looked in the rearview mirror, the figure was gone. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, where the forest finally thinned out. I drove straight home and didn't sleep that night. The next day, I told myself I'd imagined it all. But when I checked the car, there was something that proved I hadn't. Near the bottom of the driver's side door, in the thin layer of dirt that had built up from the drive-in, there was a clear handprint. It was large, smudged, but unmistakable. Whoever had been out there had gotten close enough to touch my car. I never went camping alone again after that. I don't even like driving near wooded areas at night anymore. There's something about that kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful anymore. It feels like waiting, like something's still out there, standing just far enough back that you can't see it, waiting for you to stop and listen again. I had driven out to a quiet forest about an hour from town, a place I found on an old camping forum. It wasn't a park or a campground, just a patch of woods past an abandoned logging road. I wanted to be alone for a weekend, away from everything. I parked my truck near the tree line, hiked in about a mile, and found a clearing next to a narrow creek. The ground was mostly flat, covered in pine needles and damp soil. The air smelled clean and sharp, like wet bark and cold water. I set up my tent near the creek and built a small fire pit out of stones. It was late afternoon by the time I settled in. The sunlight came through the tall trees in long, golden streaks, and everything looked calm. I cooked a can of beans on my small stove and ate sitting on a log, listening to the water move through the rocks. It was quiet except for birds and the wind. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. No traffic, no people, just stillness. As the sun went down, the woods turned dark fast. The air cooled, and the noises changed. The birds stopped, replaced by crickets and frogs. I sat by the fire and watched the light from the flames bounce off the trees. It felt peaceful but heavy in a strange way, like the woods were aware of me. The kind of silence that presses on your ears when you're truly alone. I stayed up later than I planned, feeding the fire and staring at the glowing embers. The shadows around the trees started to blur into each other, and I decided to crawl into my tent. I left the fire smoldering low. The sound of the creek helped me fall asleep, but sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. There was no sound anymore, not even the creek. It took me a second to realize that. I lay still, listening. It was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then I noticed something faint, a soft crunch of leaves, like slow footsteps. It wasn't close at first, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. The steps came in twos or threes, then paused. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It was heavier, like someone walking carefully. My tent walls were thin, and I could see the faint light from the dying fire through them. The steps came again, closer this time. I held my breath. My hand moved slowly toward the knife I kept beside me. I didn't move an inch. Couldn't. The steps stopped again. The silence stretched. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but my chest felt tight. Then I heard the sound of fabric, like something brushing against nylon. It was right outside the tent. I felt a small vibration in the ground, like someone had taken a slow step beside me. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Then the steps moved again, this time circling my tent. Slow, steady, deliberate. The sound of feet on leaves, one after another, pacing around where I lay. I felt the air in my chest start to shake. My hand gripped the knife tighter, and I thought about unzipping the tent, but I couldn't make myself do it. I just lay there, staring at the shadow of the tent's wall, watching the faint outline of movement go by, one step at a time. After maybe 2 full circles, the footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing happened. Then, after a long silence, I heard another sound. The creak again, faint but steady. The forest seemed to come back alive. Crickets started up again, and the air felt a little less heavy. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the fabric above me until I finally drifted off near dawn. When I woke up, the sun was up, and everything looked normal. The woods were bright, and I could hear birds again. For a second, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But when I stepped outside the tent, I saw footprints. They were faint but clear boot prints, not animal tracks. They circled my tent, just like I'd heard. I followed them a few feet toward the trees, but they disappeared into the leaves near the creek. Whoever it was must have walked along the rocks to avoid leaving a trail. I packed up fast that morning. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just stuffed my gear into my backpack, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and started walking back toward the truck. The woods felt different in daylight, still quiet, but not calm anymore. Every few minutes I'd stop and look behind me, thinking I heard something, but it was always just wind or branches creaking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was close. When I reached the truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it the night before. The inside was a mess. My glove box open, papers scattered on the seat, and my flashlight missing. There were boot prints in the mud beside the door. Same kind of tread as the ones around my tent. I checked the back, but nothing else was gone. My spare gas can was still there, my cooler untouched. Whoever it was didn't take much, just the flashlight. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The woods around the road looked darker even in the morning light. I drove fast, bouncing over the ruts and rocks until I hit the paved road again. Only then did I start breathing normally. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. Those slow, careful steps circling me. The sound of someone breathing near the tent. The way the forest had gone dead silent. That night, after I got home, I dumped my gear out to air it. When I opened my backpack, I found something that made my hands shake. Inside the front pocket, tucked under my lighter and knife, was my flashlight, the same one that had been missing from the truck. I hadn't put it there. The batteries were dead, and the switch was turned on like someone had used it until it ran out. I just stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of how it got there. The tent had been zipped shut all night, and the pack was inside with me. I threw the flashlight away the next morning. I haven't gone camping alone since. Every now and then, I still think about those footprints circling my tent, the silence, the slow steps. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were watching, and they knew exactly where I was. I had driven out to a quiet forest about an hour from town, a place I found on an old camping forum. It wasn't a park or a campground, just a patch of woods past an abandoned logging road. I wanted to be alone for a weekend, away from everything. I parked my truck near the tree line, hiked in about a mile, and found a clearing next to a narrow creek. The ground was mostly flat, covered in pine needles and damp soil. The air smelled clean and sharp, like wet bark and cold water. I set up my tent near the creek and built a small fire pit out of stones. It was late afternoon by the time I settled in. The sunlight came through the tall trees in long, golden streaks, and everything looked calm. I cooked a can of beans on my small stove and ate sitting on a log, listening to the water move through the rocks. It was quiet except for birds and the wind. I remember thinking it was exactly what I needed. No traffic, no people, just stillness. As the sun went down, the woods turned dark fast. The air cooled, and the noises changed. The birds stopped, replaced by crickets and frogs. I sat by the fire and watched the light from the flames bounce off the trees. It felt peaceful but heavy in a strange way, like the woods were aware of me. the kind of silence that presses on your ears when you're truly alone. I stayed up later than I planned, feeding the fire and staring at the glowing embers. The shadows around the trees started to blur into each other, and I decided to crawl into my tent. I left the fire smoldering low. The sound of the creek helped me fall asleep, but sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. There was no sound anymore, not even the creek. It took me a second to realize that. I lay still, listening. It was completely silent. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then I noticed something faint, a soft crunch of leaves, like slow footsteps. It wasn't close at first, maybe 30 or 40 feet away. The steps came in twos or threes, then paused. It wasn't an animal scurrying. It was heavier, like someone walking carefully. My tent walls were thin, and I could see the faint light from the dying fire through them. The steps came again, closer this time. I held my breath. My hand moved slowly toward the knife I kept beside me. I didn't move an inch. Couldn't. The steps stopped again. The silence stretched. I tried to tell myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon, but my chest felt tight. Then I heard the sound of fabric, like something brushing against nylon. It was right outside the tent. I felt a small vibration in the ground, like someone had taken a slow step beside me. I stayed frozen for what felt like forever. Then the steps moved again, this time circling my tent. Slow, steady, deliberate. The sound of feet on leaves, one after another, pacing around where I lay. I felt the air in my chest start to shake. My hand gripped the knife tighter, and I thought about unzipping the tent, but I couldn't make myself do it. I just lay there, staring at the shadow of the tent's wall, watching the faint outline of movement go by, one step at a time. After maybe 2 full circles, the footsteps stopped. I waited. Nothing happened. Then, after a long silence, I heard another sound. The creek again, faint but steady. The forest seemed to come back alive. Crickets started up again, and the air felt a little less heavy. I stayed awake for hours, staring at the fabric above me until I finally drifted off near dawn. When I woke up, the sun was up, and everything looked normal. The woods were bright, and I could hear birds again. For a second, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But when I stepped outside the tent, I saw footprints. They were faint but clear boot prints, not animal tracks. They circled my tent, just like I'd heard. I followed them a few feet toward the trees, but they disappeared into the leaves near the creek. Whoever it was must have walked along the rocks to avoid leaving a trail. I packed up fast that morning. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just stuffed my gear into my backpack, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and started walking back toward the truck. The woods felt different in daylight, still quiet, but not calm anymore. Every few minutes I'd stop and look behind me, thinking I heard something, but it was always just wind or branches creaking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was close. When I reached the truck, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was open. I knew I'd locked it the night before. The inside was a mess. My glove box open, papers scattered on the seat, and my flashlight missing. There were boot prints in the mud beside the door. Same kind of tread as the ones around my tent. I checked the back, but nothing else was gone. My spare gas can was still there, my cooler untouched. Whoever it was didn't take much, just the flashlight. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The woods around the road looked darker even in the morning light. I drove fast, bouncing over the ruts and rocks until I hit the paved road again. Only then did I start breathing normally. The whole drive home, I couldn't stop replaying the night in my head. Those slow, careful steps circling me. The sound of someone breathing near the tent. The way the forest had gone dead silent. That night, after I got home, I dumped my gear out to air it. When I opened my backpack, I found something that made my hands shake. Inside the front pocket, tucked under my lighter and knife, was my flashlight, the same one that had been missing from the truck. I hadn't put it there. The batteries were dead, and the switch was turned on like someone had used it until it ran out. I just stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of how it got there. The tent had been zipped shut all night, and the pack was inside with me. I threw the flashlight away the next morning. I haven't gone camping alone since. Every now and then, I still think about those footprints circling my tent, the silence, the slow steps. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They were watching, and they knew exactly where I was. It was late October when I decided to go camping alone in a forest about 2 hours from where I lived. I wanted to get away for a weekend, just to clear my head. I had been working too much, barely sleeping, and everything in my life felt like noise. I packed simple stuff: a small tent, sleeping bag, folding chair, cooler with a few drinks, a hatchet, flashlight, a knife, and some snacks. Nothing fancy. I left my phone in the car when I arrived, wanting no distractions. The campsite wasn't an official one. It was just a clearing near a narrow dirt road that stretched deep into the woods. I had found it months earlier while driving around aimlessly one evening, and it felt private, hidden, and quiet. The air was dry that day, and the ground was covered in layers of brown leaves. I parked the car in a small clearing and walked a few minutes down a slope until I reached a flat spot surrounded by thick trees. Felt calm. You couldn't hear anything but the soft rustle of the wind in the branches. I set up my tent and small fire pit before sunset, feeling good about finally being away from everything. I made a small fire when it got dark and ate a can of beans, sitting there watching the flames dance. I could smell the wood smoke mixing with the cold night air. There was something peaceful about being completely alone. Around 10 p.m., the fire burned low, and I decided to go for a short walk with my flashlight. The woods were quiet, too quiet, and the beam of light felt weak against the darkness. I could see the mist starting to form between the trees. The ground crunched beneath my boots, and every few steps I stopped to listen, just out of habit. The forest had that heavy stillness that almost feels like it's waiting. I turned back after a few minutes because the silence was getting to me. When I got back to my tent, I put out the fire completely and crawled inside my sleeping bag. I must have fallen asleep fast because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly. I didn't know why at first. It was completely dark, and I could hear my own breathing inside the tent. Then I realized there was another sound outside. It was faint but steady, something like soft crunching in the leaves. Slow, careful steps. I held my breath and listened harder. It wasn't close yet, but it was moving. I thought it could be a deer or maybe a raccoon, but the steps sounded heavier, more controlled. They weren't random like an animal's movements usually are. After a while, the sound stopped. I waited a few minutes before unzipping the tent just an inch to look outside. My eyes adjusted slowly. The moon was bright enough to see the outline of the trees, but not much else. Nothing moved. I stayed like that for a long time, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Eventually, I zipped it shut and laid back down, but I didn't sleep. Every small sound made my body tense. Sometime after, I must have dozed off again, because when I woke up the second time, the sun was just starting to rise. Everything looked normal, but I noticed something strange about the ground around my tent. The leaves looked disturbed in patches, like someone had walked around during the night. There were faint footprints, not animal prints, but shoe prints. I crouched down and studied them closely. They weren't mine. The tread was different and larger. I stood there for a while, feeling that slow wave of unease building in my stomach. Someone had been there, walking around my tent while I was sleeping. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it could have been some hiker or hunter who wandered by, but the area wasn't near any trail. I didn't see a single car on the dirt road when I arrived. Still, I tried to act normal. I made a small fire again, cooked breakfast, and pretended it didn't bother me. But it did. I kept glancing around at the trees, half expecting to see someone watching me. By afternoon, the forest was quiet again, almost too quiet. I didn't hear a single bird. Even the wind had stopped. I started feeling like I should leave early, but a stubborn part of me didn't want to. I told myself I was overreacting. I tried fishing at a small creek nearby for a few hours. The air had turned colder, and the shadows stretched long between the trees. When I finally headed back to camp, I noticed something that froze me. My folding chair, which had been by the fire pit, was gone. It wasn't blown over or moved, it was gone completely. I looked around the area, thinking maybe I placed it somewhere else earlier, but it was nowhere. That's when I started to feel that tight, electric fear in my chest. Someone had been there again. I checked my car up the hill. The doors were still locked. Everything inside was untouched. I tried to calm myself down, but I knew something wasn't right. I packed up a few things from camp and kept my knife in my hand as the sun started going down. I told myself I'd sleep in the car that night instead. It was around 8 p.m. when I got into the car. I reclined the seat a little and wrapped a blanket around myself, trying to rest. The forest outside was pitch dark. I turned off the flashlight and sat in silence. About an hour later, I heard something again. Slow footsteps, this time up near the car. I froze completely. The crunching stopped just outside my window. I didn't dare move. I could feel my heart thumping in my throat. After a few seconds, there was a faint sound of metal scraping, like something brushing against the side of the car. I turned my head slightly and saw through the reflection of the glass. Just a faint movement, a shape. Someone was standing right there. I stayed perfectly still. The shape moved away slowly toward the woods again. I waited long after the sound faded before I started the car. The engine roared in the silence and startled even me. I didn't look around. I drove straight down the narrow dirt road, not caring about the bumps or branches scraping the sides. I didn't stop until I reached the highway, and even then I pulled over to breathe, shaking all over. The next morning, I went back with a ranger. I didn't want to, but I needed to see. The ranger didn't say much as we walked down to where I had camped. Most of my stuff was still there, the tent, cooler, sleeping bag. But the ground around it was a mess of footprints, clear shoe prints all around. The ranger looked at them and then at me. They were big, heavy, and there were more than one set. Maybe 2 or 3 different pairs. That's when it hit me that I hadn't been alone that night. I had been watched, probably from the woods, maybe even from the moment I arrived. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, but the footprints were deep, circling the tent, the car, and leading off into the forest where the trees grew thick. I never camped alone again after that. Every sound at night now makes me tense up. I still think about how close they got, how they walked around quietly while I slept just a thin layer of fabric away. The chair was never found. The ranger said maybe someone passing through took it, but I knew better. Whoever was there didn't want the chair. They just wanted to let me know they were out there, watching, and that I had no idea how close they really were. I went camping by myself last summer, just to clear my head for a few days. I picked a place deep in the woods of northern Arkansas, near a small lake I found on Google Maps. It wasn't a campground, just a clearing near a dirt road that led off from a main highway. I drove up there with my small tent, sleeping bag, cooler, and a few essentials. I wanted to be completely alone for a while. No cell service, no noise, just me and nature. The first day went fine. I set up camp around noon, cooked some food on my small propane stove, and walked down to the lake. The water was still, covered in a thin layer of yellow pollen. The woods around it were thick, the kind where sound doesn't travel far. Even when I shouted once, my voice felt like it got swallowed by the trees. When the sun started to set, I built a fire and sat beside it. The air got cool quickly, and the woods became almost pitch black once the sun disappeared. I could hear insects and frogs, but not much else. No cars, no planes, no human noise. It was peaceful, but also a bit unsettling. There's something about total silence that makes you start noticing small things, like a crack in the woods or the distant rustle of branches. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was just small animals moving around. Later that night, around 11, I was sitting by the fire staring at the flames when I noticed something faint, like the sound of metal knocking. It wasn't close. It was far off in the woods, maybe 100 yards or more, just faint enough that I couldn't tell what it was. Came once, then silence, then again, like 2 metal objects tapping. I turned off my little lantern to listen better. Nothing. Then again, that same dull metallic sound, steady but not constant. I sat there for a while, my eyes fixed on the dark line of trees beyond my campsite. I decided to go to my tent and try to sleep, even though I couldn't stop thinking about that noise. Inside the tent, I zipped up the entrance and lay still. The sound came again after a few minutes, but now it was quieter, like it had moved further away. Eventually, I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke up early. The fire pit had burned down to cold ash. I made coffee and walked around the edge of the woods, just exploring. About 50 feet into the trees, I found an old piece of metal pipe lying on the ground, rusted and dented. Maybe that's what I'd heard the night before, something falling or hitting another piece of metal. I shrugged it off, though it felt weird finding that pipe so far from any house or structure. That day I fished a little, ate, and read a book I brought. Around 6 p.m., I noticed a few tire tracks near the dirt road leading to my campsite. Fresh ones, like someone had driven by recently. I hadn't seen any cars all day. I didn't think much of it, but made a mental note to stay aware. That night, around midnight, I woke up to something strange. I couldn't hear the insects anymore. It was completely silent outside. Not a single sound. Usually the woods are full of life, but at that moment it felt dead. I sat up in my tent and just listened. I didn't even breathe for a second. Then I heard soft footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human. They were light, careful, like someone trying not to be heard. They circled around the area slowly, crunching on dried leaves. I froze, trying not to make any noise. The footsteps stopped right near my tent. I could see a faint shadow moving outside, just a dark shape through the thin tent fabric. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The person, or whatever it was, stood there for a while, then walked away toward the trees. I didn't move until the sound was gone completely. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sky started turning gray, I unzipped my tent and looked around. Nothing seemed touched, but about 30 feet from my tent, there were boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier. Someone had definitely been there. I thought about leaving right then, but part of me didn't want to believe it was a person. Maybe it was a hunter or someone passing through. I stayed another day, but I was on edge the whole time. Every small sound made me jump. I didn't wander far from the camp. That evening, I made the fire earlier, before sunset. I wanted light before it got too dark. The air felt heavy, humid, and the woods seemed quieter than usual again. Around 10, I heard a noise from the dirt road, the faint crunch of tires on gravel. Then headlights flickered through the trees for a second and disappeared. The vehicle must have turned off the road or stopped nearby. I didn't hear it drive away. After a while, I noticed movement at the edge of the woods. A figure was standing just beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't see details, just a shape. It wasn't moving much, just standing there. I stared at it for what felt like minutes. Finally, it turned slowly and walked back into the darkness. I packed everything before dawn. My hands were shaking the whole time. I just wanted to get out. When I got to my car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The driver's side door was open. I always lock it, always. The glove compartment was open, and some of my stuff was on the passenger seat, like someone had gone through it. There were muddy boot prints on the ground near the door. I drove out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about an hour away. When I went to use the bathroom there, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. There was a small piece of torn paper sticking out of my jacket pocket, one I hadn't seen before. It was folded tight. I opened it, and inside was a map of the area I'd been camping in. My campsite was circled in red pen. Nothing else, just that circle. I didn't go back to the woods after that. I still think about that night sometimes. The sound of footsteps, the person standing just far enough away that I couldn't see their face, the car that stopped on the road. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I was being watched the whole time I was there. Every night, every sound, every small movement. Someone knew I was alone, and they waited until the dark to come close enough to let me know it. I had been planning that camping trip for weeks. It wasn't anything special, just a weekend alone in the woods, away from my phone, my job, and people in general. I picked a place I'd been to once before with a few friends years ago. A quiet stretch of forest about 3 hours from home, beside a lake that barely anyone visited. There was a dirt road that led close enough for me to park my truck, and from there, it was about a half-mile walk through thick trees before the trail opened into a clearing right by the water. That's where I set up my tent. It was late afternoon when I got there. The air smelled like wet pine and mud. I could hear small insects already humming somewhere near the waterline. I set up camp slowly, taking my time, enjoying the quiet. The tent went up first, then I unpacked my small cooler, a folding chair, and the few things I brought to cook dinner. Felt peaceful. The light from the setting sun cut through the trees, turning everything orange and soft. I sat by the lake for a while, watching how calm the water looked, completely still like glass. By the time I finished eating and cleaning up, it was almost dark. The woods get quiet at night in a way that makes every small sound feel loud. I built a fire and just stared at it for a long time. I didn't have any music or books. I wanted silence. But after a while, that silence started to feel strange. I couldn't hear the bugs anymore. I noticed it when I realized how loud the fire crackled. No crickets, no frogs, no wind, just my fire and my breathing. I brushed it off and went to my tent. The ground felt a little soft under my sleeping bag, like it had been wet earlier. I lay there staring at the top of the tent for a while. I wasn't really tired yet. My mind kept wandering. I thought about how far away I was from the road. If I screamed, no one would hear me. It wasn't fear exactly, just a heavy thought that stuck in my chest. Sometime during the night, I woke up. The fire outside had gone out. It was dead silent again, not even a rustle of leaves. I lay there still, trying to figure out what had woken me. Then I heard it, a crunch, faint but clear. It sounded like someone stepping on the ground outside my tent. I held my breath. It came again, a slow dragging sound, like a boot scraping across dirt. My first thought was an animal, maybe a deer or even a raccoon, but it didn't sound like that. The steps were slow and steady, too heavy for a small animal. I stayed frozen for what felt like minutes. The sound stopped. I listened so hard my ears hurt. Nothing. I finally sat up and reached for the small flashlight next to me. The beam shook as I turned it on. The tent lit up inside, but all I could see was the thin outline of trees through the fabric. I waited again, but the sound didn't come back. Eventually, I told myself it was just my imagination, or maybe a branch falling. The next morning, everything looked normal. Birds were chirping again. The lake looked calm. I walked around the clearing, checking for tracks or anything unusual, but there was nothing. The ground was soft, but I couldn't see any clear footprints. I tried to shake off the weird feeling from the night before. I decided to go for a walk through the woods, just to explore. I followed a faint trail uphill, away from the lake. The air was colder under the trees. The ground was covered in wet leaves, and every step made a soft crunch. I didn't see any animals, which was odd because normally you'd at least hear squirrels or something running off. After walking maybe 20 minutes, I came across something strange, an old campsite. It looked abandoned for years. The fire pit was half filled with mud, and the remains of a tent were tangled in a bush. The fabric was faded and torn. It looked like someone had just left everything behind. I didn't go too close, but I could see some old cans and what looked like a boot half buried in the dirt. I felt uneasy, like I shouldn't be there. I turned around and went back to my camp, but that image stuck in my head. When night came again, I made sure to build a bigger fire. I sat close to it, watching the flames rise and fall. I kept glancing toward the tree line every few seconds. Around midnight, I heard something again. It wasn't steps this time. It was a sound like metal scraping against wood. It came from the same direction as before, toward the trees behind my tent. It was slow, irregular, like something dragging. My stomach twisted. I grabbed my flashlight again and pointed it that way. The light barely reached past a few trees. Everything beyond that was black. The sound stopped. My heartbeat felt loud enough to hear. I stayed like that for at least 10 minutes, listening. Nothing. I tried to convince myself again it was an animal. Maybe a branch swinging in the wind. But the air was still. That night, I barely slept. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something faint. Leaves crunching, small snapping sounds. Each time I told myself it was nothing. The next morning, I decided I'd pack up early. I didn't like the feeling anymore. When I went behind the tent to roll up the tarp, I froze. The dirt there was disturbed. Not just footprints, drag marks. Like something heavy had been pulled past my tent during the night. The line in the soil went from the edge of the trees to the lake, a faint, uneven trail. I followed it with my eyes. It disappeared right where the water started. I stood there for a long time trying to understand what could have made that. Maybe an animal had dragged something it caught. But the marks looked too straight, too deliberate. I went to the lake's edge and looked down. The water was cloudy and still. My reflection stared back, but below the surface, I thought I saw something darker. I bent closer, squinting. There was something submerged just a few feet from shore. A shape. It looked like a log at first, but it wasn't. The edges were too smooth. It looked like fabric, caught on a branch underwater. I felt a cold rush through my chest. I didn't move for a minute. Then I grabbed my stuff and started packing. I didn't even bother folding the tent properly. I just threw everything into the truck bed and left. I didn't look back once. On the drive home, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept thinking about that old campsite I'd found. The torn tent, the single boot half buried in dirt. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop replaying the sound I'd heard at night. The dragging noise, the heavy steps, the silence that followed. A few days later, I searched online for anything about missing campers in that area. There were a few old reports. The last one I found mentioned a man who went missing near the lake about 6 years ago. His body was never recovered. I never went back there again. Sometimes I wonder if what I saw under the water was just my mind playing tricks on me. But sometimes, late at night, when everything around me is quiet, I still hear that slow, scraping sound in my head. The sound of something heavy being dragged through wet dirt, just outside my tent. I went camping alone in late October, just before the real cold set in. It was one of those trips I had planned for weeks but kept putting off because of work and weather. The place I chose was an old forest reserve about 40 miles from town. It wasn't an official campsite, just a wide clearing near a creek that I found on a map. I liked the idea of being completely alone, away from the noise of people and cars. I wanted silence, fresh air, and that strange comfort that comes from being somewhere untouched. I got there just after noon. The sky was dull gray, and the ground was covered with damp leaves from the rain a few days earlier. My boots sank a little as I walked. The smell of wet earth and pine needles hung in the air. I parked my truck on a narrow dirt path that disappeared behind a thick line of trees, unloaded my gear, and started setting up the tent. The ground wasn't even, but I made it work. I built a small fire pit with stones I found nearby, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some wood before it got dark. By the time the sun went down, everything was in place. I cooked a can of soup on my small stove and ate it sitting by the fire. The forest around me was completely still except for the occasional snapping of branches far off and the faint rush of water from the creek. The silence felt heavy after a while. I tried to focus on the sound of the fire instead, the soft crackling that kept me company. When the dark settled in, I sat there for a long time doing nothing. I watched the flames die down and looked out into the black space between the trees. There was no moon that night, and without it, the woods felt endless. I couldn't even see my truck from where I was sitting. I thought about how strange it is that you can feel so isolated just a few miles from civilization. The forest has a way of swallowing everything: light, sound, even time. Around midnight, I went inside my tent. I zipped it up, turned off my lantern, and lay on my back staring at the fabric above me. The cold had started creeping in, so I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around my neck. I could still hear faint rustling outside, probably small animals. But after a few minutes, the noises stopped. Completely. It was like the forest froze. I listened harder, but there was nothing. Just silence pressing against the tent walls. Then I heard something. Not an animal sound this time. It was dull, slow, rhythmic, like soft steps on wet ground. It came from the direction of the creek. I held my breath. The steps continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I waited, eyes wide open in the dark, trying to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer, maybe even the sound of water trickling weirdly. I stayed still for almost 10 minutes, not daring to move. Eventually, the sound didn't come back, and I forced myself to relax. I pulled the bag over my head and tried to sleep. When I woke up, the fire was dead, and a faint light was pushing through the tent fabric. The morning air was freezing, and everything outside was wet from dew. I stepped out and stretched, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling from the night before. My boots were muddy, though I had left them under the tarp beside the tent. That made no sense, but I brushed it off and got busy boiling water for coffee. While I was waiting, I noticed something odd near the edge of the trees. A pile of sticks, stacked almost neatly in a small pyramid. I hadn't seen that the day before. It wasn't big, maybe a foot tall, but it looked deliberate. Too neat to be random. I walked closer, thinking maybe the wind had shifted some fallen branches together. But when I got there, I saw footprints in the mud. Human ones, bare feet. The prints were faint but clear enough to make out the shape of toes. They led from the creek toward the trees, right past my tent, and stopped near the little pile of sticks. I felt my stomach tighten. I looked around, scanning the trees, expecting to see someone, but there was no one. I didn't hear anything either. The forest was quiet again, heavy and still. I kicked over the pile of sticks without really thinking and went back to my camp. I told myself someone must have been passing through, maybe a hunter or a hiker, though it didn't make sense for them to walk barefoot in the cold. The rest of the day, I tried to keep busy. I fished for a while in the creek, chopped more wood, and hiked around the area. The forest was beautiful in daylight, open, calm, harmless. But when evening came again, I started to feel uneasy. As the sun dipped below the trees, the temperature dropped fast, and the shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. I rebuilt my fire, ate dinner quickly, and tried not to look into the dark. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing noises again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. There was something else. A slow, dragging sound, like something being pulled through the wet leaves. It came from the direction of the creek again. I sat completely still, heart pounding, my flashlight in hand. The sound got closer, then stopped right near my truck. I could see the faint reflection of the metal in the dim light from the fire. Then, nothing. Silence again. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I wanted to call out, but I didn't. I just stared into the dark for what felt like an hour, waiting for something to move. Eventually, I grabbed my keys, locked the truck from the inside, and sat there with my flashlight pointed at the trees. I didn't sleep that night. When dawn came, I finally got out. The ground near my truck was covered with muddy smears, like someone had been crawling. The driver's side door handle had dirt on it, and there were more bare footprints. Smaller this time, maybe from a child, though the thought of that made my skin crawl. They led away from the truck and vanished into the trees. I didn't pack up properly. I just threw everything into the back of the truck, started it, and drove out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I looked in the rearview mirror for the last time, the forest was just a line of dark green fading in the distance. Later, when I got home, I checked the mud on my truck. On the lower part of the door, near where I had seen the smears, there were marks, small handprints, clear as day. I scrubbed them off, but it took a while. The smell of the wet earth stayed on my hands even after washing. I've gone camping plenty of times since then, but never alone again. Every time I hear running water or see a clearing surrounded by thick trees, I think about that night. The steps, the sticks, the handprints. I never figured out who or what was out there, but I know someone was, and they were close, too close. I went camping alone one weekend in late September, just before the weather started turning cold. I picked a spot deep inside a forested area about 2 hours from home. It wasn't an official campsite, just a small clearing I had found a year earlier when hiking. It was quiet, surrounded by tall pines, and far from any main trail. I wanted silence, just time away from everything. I packed light, a small tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, cooler, and a folding chair. I reached the spot by evening and set up camp before sunset. The woods were still, with only faint wind sounds and the occasional creak of branches. Felt peaceful at first, exactly what I wanted. After setting up the tent, I lit a small fire and cooked a few sausages. The smoke hung low between the trees. Everything smelled like pine and dirt. The air cooled fast as the light faded, and I wrapped myself in a jacket. There was no signal on my phone, and I didn't care. Felt good to disconnect. By the time darkness fully settled, the forest turned pitch black except for the small circle of orange light from my fire. I sat for a while, listening to the crackling wood and faraway insects. Then I heard something faint, like leaves crunching, but distant. I brushed it off as a small animal and went back to staring into the flames. Around 10 p.m., the noises became more noticeable. Not loud, but spaced out. A stick snapping somewhere behind me, then silence. A few minutes later, the sound of something brushing against a bush. It wasn't constant, but every time I started to relax, another noise came. It didn't sound like a deer. Deer move fast and in bursts. This was slower, like someone walking carefully. I told myself it was probably raccoons or maybe a fox. I tried to focus on the fire, but my ears stayed alert. Eventually, the fire burned down low. I didn't want to get up to gather more wood. The thought of walking even 10 feet into the dark forest made my stomach feel tight. The light from my flashlight barely reached past a few trees, and beyond that, it was just pure black. I finally forced myself to crawl into the tent. I zipped it closed and turned off the flashlight, trying to rest. The night was dead quiet except for my breathing and the occasional gust through the branches. After maybe half an hour, I heard it again. Slow footsteps on the leaves. I froze. It wasn't far away now. I could tell the direction. Just outside the tent, a little to the left. I held my breath. The sound stopped. Then I heard a long drag, like something scraping over the ground. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I told myself not to panic, that maybe it was the wind shifting something. But then, a small tap. Something brushed lightly against the side of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and switched it on. The beam lit up the inside of the tent and made the thin fabric glow faintly orange from outside. I aimed it toward the wall where the noise came from, but all I saw was the dull outline of branches and shadows. I listened hard, but there was nothing. The woods had gone silent again. I stayed like that for what felt like forever, holding the flashlight in one hand, my other gripping the handle of the camping knife I kept next to my sleeping bag. I didn't move. Eventually, exhaustion took over and I dozed off sitting up. When I woke, it was around 3 a.m. My flashlight had rolled onto the floor. The tent was cold, and I could hear soft rain hitting the fabric. But underneath that, I heard another sound, breathing. Slow, heavy breathing just outside. It wasn't mine. I froze again. It sounded like someone standing just feet away. Then the breathing stopped, and I heard soft crunches, like footsteps circling. I clenched my knife tighter. The footsteps moved slowly, then faded into the distance. I sat there in the dark for nearly an hour before daring to move. As the first hint of dawn appeared, I crawled out of the tent. The ground was wet and covered in pine needles. Everything looked normal at first, but a few feet away from the tent, there were boot prints in the mud. Not animal tracks, real human prints. Deep, heavy ones. They circled the tent once, then disappeared toward the trees. I followed them a few steps before they vanished into thicker brush. The thought of someone watching me out there, walking around my camp in the dark, made my stomach twist. I started packing up immediately. I didn't eat, didn't even bother to pour out the water I had boiled the night before. I just tore down the tent, shoved everything into the trunk, and started the car. As I drove down the narrow dirt road that led back to the main road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there. A few miles later, I stopped near a gas station to calm down. The attendant told me that area wasn't safe for camping alone. He said some people had reported hearing strange noises out there lately, and that a few campsites had been found abandoned, gear still left behind. He didn't go into detail, and I didn't ask for any. When I got home, I unpacked everything slowly, trying to shake the unease. I found muddy smears on the side of my tent, like someone had run their hand across it. I hadn't noticed them earlier. I thought about the breathing, the slow movements around me, the tracks. Whoever had been out there wasn't lost or wandering. They knew where I was and what they were doing. I haven't gone camping alone since that night. Sometimes when I'm trying to sleep, I still think about those slow footsteps circling my tent and that soft drag across the ground. The woods used to feel peaceful to me, a place to escape. But after that, I can't hear silence the same way anymore. Now, every quiet space feels like it's waiting for something to move in the dark, something human, standing just out of sight, watching. I went camping by myself in the middle of September, in a small area deep inside the woods of northern Arkansas. It wasn't a big campground with people around or marked trails. It was one of those hidden spots you find by following a narrow dirt road that turns into nothing but tire tracks. I'd gone there a few times before, and I liked how quiet it was. No cell service, no people, just the sound of trees and insects. I packed light, just a tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a small gas stove, and enough food and water for 2 days. By the time I parked my car at the end of that narrow path, it was already evening. The sky had that fading orange color that slowly turns to blue before night comes in. I walked about 100 yards off the trail to where I usually camped. There was a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees, and the ground there was flat enough for a tent. I could see the top of a small ridge to the east and a creek down the slope to the west. The air smelled like damp wood and dirt. I set up my tent, started a small fire, and cooked some canned food. When the darkness settled in, the woods got completely silent except for the constant sound of crickets and the occasional snap of a twig far away. I always liked that feeling, the world shrinking down to just the glow of the fire and the things inside its light. I sat for a while watching the flames flicker, then turned in around 10. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the air had gotten colder. Sometime during the night, I woke up without knowing why. It felt like something had pulled me out of sleep, like a noise I'd missed or maybe just a strange feeling. I stayed still for a moment, listening. The forest was quiet, but not in a normal way. The insects had stopped. It was like the whole place was holding its breath. I could hear only my own heartbeat and the faint rustle of the nylon tent moving with the breeze. Then I heard it, a slow, dragging sound coming from somewhere outside the tent. It wasn't close at first, just a faint scrape on dirt, like someone was pulling something heavy through the leaves. It would stop for a few seconds, then start again. I thought it could have been an animal, maybe a deer moving through brush, but it didn't sound like steps. It was too steady, too deliberate. I sat up and reached for my flashlight, careful not to make much noise. I clicked it on and pointed it at the thin wall of the tent. The fabric glowed pale yellow from the light, and I saw faint shadows of tree branches swaying, but nothing else. The dragging sound stopped completely. I waited, holding my breath, and for a moment I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Then, right outside the tent, there was a quick, sharp crunch, like someone had stepped on a dry branch. My whole body went tense. I turned off the light immediately and sat there in the dark, my ears straining for any noise. The sound didn't come back, and after what felt like forever, the normal forest sounds slowly returned. The crickets started again. I stayed awake for another hour, then eventually drifted off again. When I woke up in the morning, everything looked normal. The sun was out, the woods were calm, and it almost felt silly how scared I'd been. I got out of the tent and walked around a bit, and that's when I noticed the tracks. Not footprints exactly, but a trail of flattened grass and disturbed soil running from behind my tent toward the tree line. It looked like something had been dragged, like a bag or a tarp. I followed it a few feet before it disappeared into thicker brush. I figured maybe a bear had dragged something from another campsite, Or maybe a hunter had been moving a deer carcass, though I hadn't heard any gunshots the day before. I spent most of that day hiking and didn't think much more about it. By evening, I was back at camp, tired and sweaty. I made another small fire, ate, and sat there watching the sun go down behind the ridge. Around 9 p.m., I put out the fire and went into my tent. The night was clear, and I could see the stars through the mesh roof. The forest felt calm again, and I actually started to feel relaxed. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, the same dragging sound. This time, it was farther away, somewhere in the direction of the creek. I sat up immediately, wide awake. The sound went on for a long time, stopping and starting, like something was being pulled slowly through wet soil. Then it stopped completely. A minute later, I heard a faint splash, like something heavy had fallen into the water. After that, silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every small noise made me flinch. Around 5 a.m., when it started to get light, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The air was cold and foggy, and the grass was wet with dew. I walked toward the creek, following the direction the sound had come from. When I got closer, I noticed something strange, fresh drag marks again, cutting through the grass and going straight down the slope. They ended right at the edge of the creek. The mud there was churned up like something had been forced into the water. The water itself was shallow and moving slowly, but there was a dark patch in the mud that didn't look right. It was wide and deep, like a hole or maybe a soft spot where something had been sitting. I crouched down and noticed a piece of fabric half buried in the mud. It was faded and torn, looked like part of a jacket. I pulled it out and saw that it was old and dirty, maybe there for months. But there was something else near it, what looked like the handle of a plastic cooler sticking out of the bank downstream. I went closer and saw that it wasn't a cooler. It was a part of a car bumper. A small piece, cracked and muddy, with a faded registration sticker still on it. I couldn't read the whole number, but it was clear enough to tell it had been there for a long time. Then it hit me. This might have been where that missing car they talked about on the local news months ago had gone. A family had disappeared near this area, last seen on some rural road. Search teams had combed parts of the forest but never found the car. I stood there for a long time, staring at that muddy creek and the drag marks leading into it. My stomach felt tight. I didn't want to believe I'd been camping right next to whatever had been buried or hidden here. The dragging sound I'd heard both nights. It hadn't been an animal. Someone had been coming back, maybe to move something or to make sure it stayed hidden. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, barely looking around. I didn't eat, didn't even put the fire out properly. I just left. I drove until I got cell service and then called the police, told them what I'd found near the creek off that unmarked road. They took my report, and a few days later I saw on the news that authorities had found a car submerged in the creek, matching the missing family's vehicle. The reporter said it looked like the car had been there for months, hidden under branches and mud. They said there were signs someone had been back there recently. No arrests yet. That night, when I lay in bed, all I could think about was the sound of something dragging through the dark, slow and steady, like someone trying to move a secret that didn't want to stay buried. I went camping alone that weekend because I needed to clear my head. I drove out to a place I found online, an old logging area that hadn't been used for years. The dirt road leading there was narrow and uneven, filled with deep ruts from heavy tires long gone. My small truck rattled as I drove deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, almost leaning in on the path, and the sunlight barely reached the ground. It felt isolated, but that was what I wanted. No noise, no people, no interruptions. When I arrived, I found a small clearing just big enough for my tent and a small fire. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there was a small creek nearby that trickled quietly through the rocks. I set up my tent, built a fire pit from stones, and gathered enough branches to last the night. The air smelled damp, earthy, and cold. After setting everything up, I sat by the fire as the sky darkened. The woods turned from green to black, and the sounds changed. During the day, I heard birds and the distant rustle of leaves, but now it was quieter, heavier. Every small sound carried farther, A stick breaking somewhere off in the distance sounded sharper than it should have. I cooked a can of beans over the fire and ate slowly. The flames flickered against the trees, and my truck sat just a few feet away, half hidden in shadow. It felt strange how still it all was. Even the creek sounded quieter as the night grew colder. I tried to relax, but my mind wouldn't settle. Every few minutes I kept turning my head, expecting to see something just past the firelight. But there was nothing. When I finally decided to sleep, I put out the fire until it was only a few glowing embers and climbed into the tent. Inside, it was completely dark except for the dim orange light fading from outside. The ground felt uneven beneath my sleeping bag. I lay there listening to the forest. The wind had stopped. There were no crickets, no owls, nothing, just silence. Sometime later, I woke up without knowing why. My chest felt tight, and my body was tense like it already knew something was wrong. I opened my eyes and could barely see the faint outline of the tent walls. There was no sound at all, not even the creek. Then I heard its slow, heavy footsteps on the pine needles outside. They weren't close at first, maybe 30 or 40 feet away, moving through the brush in a steady rhythm. One step, pause, another, then a few faster ones like someone trying to move quietly but failing. I held my breath and waited. The steps stopped completely, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. I thought maybe it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the pattern didn't sound right. It wasn't 4 quick steps. It was 2 slow, careful, human. My chest started to ache from holding my breath. I didn't want to move or make any noise, but I reached over to my bag and slowly unzipped it to grab the flashlight. The zipper sounded way too loud in the quiet. I froze halfway through. Then I heard the sound of dry leaves crunching just a few feet from the tent. It wasn't coming from the direction of the creek or the road. It was from behind the tent, where the trees were thickest. Whoever it was had moved around in a half circle. My body went cold. I didn't know what to do. If I turned on the light, I'd give away that I was awake. If I stayed still, I wouldn't know where they were. I waited. My ears were ringing from the silence. A few seconds passed before something brushed lightly against the side of the tent. It was quick, like a hand dragging across the fabric. I could see the faint ripple of the material in the dark. Then another sound, a slow tearing noise, like someone running a knife along the outer layer. That's when my body moved before my mind could think. I ripped the zipper open, jumped out barefoot, and pointed the flashlight into the trees. The beam hit nothing, just a line of trees and shadows. My fire was completely dead, the air cold enough that I could see my breath. I turned in circles, sweeping the light across every inch of the clearing. Nothing moved. Then, as I turned toward the creek, I saw it. Near the edge of the trees, there was a backpack leaning against a stump. It wasn't mine. It was dirty, old, and half unzipped, like someone had dropped it in a hurry. I stood frozen, light shaking in my hand. The bag looked like it had been there a while, but I hadn't noticed it earlier when I set up. It was right at the edge of the clearing where I had been collecting wood. I took a slow step closer. Inside, I could see a small rusted knife, a water bottle, and a black notebook. The notebook was open, but the pages were wet and unreadable. It didn't look abandoned recently, it looked used. That's when I realized something else. Around the bag, there were small patches of disturbed ground, like someone had been kneeling or sitting there. Fresh tracks, maybe a day old, led back toward the woods behind my tent. I followed them with the flashlight until they disappeared into darkness. The trees were too close together to see much farther. I didn't care what it was anymore. I ran back to my truck, started it, and turned the lights on full beam. The headlights cut through the clearing, bright and white, showing the trees in every direction. There was nothing, no movement, no sound, just the shape of my tent and that old backpack by the stump. I didn't even pack up my things. I left the tent, the fire pit, everything. When I reached the main road, it felt like I had escaped something heavy that had been hanging over me the whole night. I drove for nearly 2 hours before stopping at a gas station. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my drink. I kept thinking about the backpack, about the tracks leading behind my tent, about how quiet the forest had been. The next day, I went online to see if anyone had reported anything about that area. Missing people, hunters, old campsites. There were a few posts about people finding abandoned camping gear deep in those woods, but no one ever claimed it. A few hikers had even said they felt watched or followed when they camped near that creek. I didn't go back for my stuff. I didn't even want to see that place again. But for weeks after, I couldn't sleep right. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard those slow, heavy footsteps on pine needles, coming closer, stopping, and waiting right outside thin fabric walls. And I still think about that backpack sometimes. The way it looked too clean to be truly abandoned. Like someone still used it. Like someone had been there the whole time, watching quietly from the trees, waiting for the fire to go out. I went camping alone that weekend because I needed a break from everything. Work had been exhausting, and I hadn't been sleeping well. I picked a small, quiet spot deep in the woods near an old logging trail about an hour away from town. It wasn't a campsite, just a clearing beside a narrow creek with thick trees on all sides. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air smelled clean, sharp, and cold. I arrived in the late afternoon, parked my car a few hundred feet down a rough dirt path, and hiked the rest of the way in with my backpack and tent. The sun was dropping behind the trees when I got the fire going, and by dark, the forest had gone completely silent except for the soft sound of water running over stones in the creek. At first, the silence felt peaceful. There was no cell signal, no traffic, nothing artificial. Just the woods and me. I made a small meal over the fire and sat there watching the flames twist and shift in the dark. I kept hearing random cracks in the distance, the kind of noises you can't place. Branches snapping, small thuds, rustling leaves. But I told myself it was just animals moving around. The woods are never completely still. Every so often, I'd shine my flashlight in that direction, but the light would hit nothing but trunks and brush. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed how dark it was beyond the edge of the fire. It felt like the trees were closing in, but I told myself it was just my mind adjusting to the quiet. By midnight, I was in my tent, lying in my sleeping bag. The fire had burned down to orange coals outside, and I could still see a faint glow through the fabric. The night had that heavy, endless kind of quiet that made me aware of every breath I took. I lay there for a while, listening to the wind push softly through the branches, and then I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was waking up suddenly to a sharp noise. It sounded like something hit metal. I stayed still for a second, thinking maybe it was part of a dream, but then I heard it again. A clear, short metallic sound. My car was the only thing around that could make that kind of noise. It was parked down the trail behind a few trees, maybe 100 feet away. At first, I thought maybe an animal had brushed against it or something had fallen on it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was deliberate. It wasn't random. Came once, then paused, then again. I sat up in my sleeping bag, listening. My mouth had gone dry. I turned off my headlamp so there wouldn't be any light from the tent, just in case someone was out there. I waited for a long minute, staring at the thin tent walls, barely breathing. Then I heard it again, metal creaking, followed by a dull thump. It sounded closer this time, like someone had shut a door softly. My heart started pounding hard in my chest. I slowly unzipped the tent, inch by inch, careful not to make noise. The air outside was freezing and still. I crouched halfway out, looking toward where the car was, but I couldn't see anything through the trees. My fire had burned almost completely out, only faint red coals giving off light. Everything else was just shadows and blackness. I sat there, frozen, listening. Nothing moved. I thought about shouting or turning on my flashlight, but something in my gut told me not to. I just stayed still and waited. A minute passed. Then another. Then I heard the sound of gravel shifting down the trail, like slow footsteps. That's when I realized someone was out there. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too steady, too human. Each step came with a small crunch, then a pause, then another crunch, like someone trying to move quietly. I could tell they were coming from the direction of my car, heading toward me. I backed into the tent and reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. Maybe a hiker? But it was past 2 a.m. Maybe someone who lived nearby? But I hadn't seen a single house for miles on the drive-in. Then I thought about my car again. What if they were trying to break into it? The steps stopped. Total silence. I held my breath, straining my ears. Nothing. I felt like I was being watched, even though I couldn't see anyone. I waited maybe 10 minutes, maybe longer. Then, out of nowhere, there was a faint sound, something brushing against fabric. It was right behind the tent. I could hear it clearly now, the soft drag of something sliding over nylon. My body went rigid. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, then stopped. The air was so still that even the creak sounded far away. I finally forced myself to grab the knife I kept near my sleeping bag. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold it. I didn't move or make a sound. I just sat there, waiting for anything else. Another 5 minutes passed. Then I heard slow footsteps again, this time moving away, fading back toward the trees. Crunch, 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 then nothing. I stayed completely still for almost an hour before I worked up the courage to unzip the tent. When I did, the air felt colder, heavier. I could see faint light from the moon cutting through the trees, and the coals had burned out. I scanned around with my flashlight, sweeping it across the clearing. The grass looked untouched. My backpack was where I left it, but when I walked over to my car, I saw something that made my stomach turn. There were muddy footprints on the driver's side door, like someone had stood right next to it, pressing against the metal. The handle was smeared with dirt, and the door was slightly open. Not much, just enough to see the interior light flickering weakly before it went out. I checked inside, heart pounding, and saw the glove box open, papers scattered. The small knife I kept in the side pocket was gone. I looked around with my flashlight, but the trail behind the car vanished into the trees, and I couldn't see where the footprints went. I stood there listening, but the woods were dead quiet again. I didn't waste another second. I stuffed everything I could grab from my tent into the back seat and didn't even bother folding the gear. I just threw it in and got behind the wheel. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the keys once before I started the car. As soon as the headlights came on, I saw the trail ahead, the narrow dirt road cutting through the trees. I pressed the gas and didn't stop until I hit pavement again. My rearview mirror showed nothing but black forest. When I got home that morning, I checked my car in daylight. The footprints were still there, bare, human, and small, like they belonged to someone young. There were 4 of them on the door and 2 faint ones near the back bumper. The dirt around them was from the forest floor, a mix of mud and pine needles. I thought about calling the police, but what could I even say? There was no one to report, nothing stolen except that one knife, and no proof of anything else. Just prints that washed away after it rained later that day. I never went back to that spot. I still think about that night sometimes, about the soft sound of something brushing the tent and the way those steps moved slowly toward me. Someone had been watching me out there, moving through the dark while I slept. They weren't trying to scare me. They were trying to get close enough without being seen. And I'll never know if they stopped because I woke up or if they just decided to wait for another night. It was late October when I decided to go camping alone in a wooded area about an hour from town. I'd been there once before with some friends years ago, and I remembered it being quiet, surrounded by thick trees and a small river that ran behind the campsites. I wanted a weekend away from everything, no phone, no noise, no people. I packed my tent, a sleeping bag, a folding chair, some food, and a small cooler. By the time I left home, the sun was already starting to set. And by the time I reached the dirt road that led into the forest, the sky was a deep gray blue and the air had turned cold. The last few miles were rough. The gravel road was uneven, full of holes, and surrounded by tall pines that blocked out most of the remaining light. My headlights bounced off the trunks, giving the illusion of movement on both sides. When I finally reached the clearing where I planned to set up camp, it was nearly dark. I could see the faint shimmer of the river beyond the trees. I parked the car off to the side and started setting up my tent under the weak light of my headlamp. The air smelled like damp earth and pine needles. Once I had the tent up, I built a small fire using some dry wood I brought. The orange glow spread just enough to make the area around me visible. I heated up a can of soup and ate in silence, listening to the soft crackle of the fire and the faint sound of running water in the distance. For a while, it felt peaceful, the kind of quiet you can only get far away from other people. But as the night deepened, the silence started to feel heavier. The woods around me were so still that even small noises stood out sharply. A twig snapping somewhere behind the tent. The sound of something moving through the brush down near the river. I kept telling myself it was just animals. The forest was full of them. Deer, raccoons, maybe even a coyote or two. Still, every sound made me look up from the fire. Around midnight, the temperature dropped fast. I added more wood to the fire and pulled my jacket tighter. The flame flickered low, and in the dim light, the shadows of the trees looked like they were moving. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent. The sleeping bag was cold, and I could hear the wind picking up slightly, brushing through the tops of the trees. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. Something close. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't an animal noise or the wind. It was the slow crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. They weren't heavy, but steady, one after another, moving around my tent. My eyes opened wide in the dark. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps circled once, stopped, then started again farther off. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. I thought maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, maybe a deer walking around. But then I heard the faint metallic sound of something tapping against my car. That was no animal. I waited. The noise stopped completely. I didn't dare unzip the tent or even move. After what felt like forever, I finally heard the crunch of leaves fading into the distance. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, staring at the faint outline of the tent walls, waiting for the sound to come back. It never did. When the first light of morning came, I got out of the tent and walked over to the car. There were 2 long, smudged streaks on the back window, like someone had dragged their fingers across the dirt and dust. I told myself it was nothing, just condensation or maybe tree branches brushing against it. But when I walked around the other side, I saw clear footprints in the soft ground, leading from the edge of the trees right up to the tent, then back out again toward the woods. The prints looked fresh, still sharp in the cold morning air. I crouched down and saw that they were from boots, human boots, not hiking shoes or work boots, but something older, maybe military or heavy duty. I followed them a few yards into the trees before they disappeared into the brush. I couldn't tell where they went after that. I stood there for a long time listening. The forest was silent again, just like the night before. I tried to shake it off. I made breakfast, packed up some of my stuff, and tried to convince myself it was just someone passing through. Maybe a hunter or another camper. But something about those prints bothered me. There were no other campsites nearby, and I hadn't seen a single vehicle when I drove in. I hadn't heard a gunshot, an engine, or anything else all night. Whoever it was had come on foot, quietly, and had walked right up to where I was sleeping. I thought about leaving that morning, but I didn't want to feel like I'd let fear ruin my trip. So I stayed another night. During the day, everything felt fine again. I fished by the river, collected some firewood, and sat reading for a while. But as the sun went down, that same uneasy feeling came back. The air got still, and the forest seemed to hold its breath. When night fully settled in, I sat close to the fire, staring into the flames. Every now and then, I'd look around at the darkness beyond the light. I couldn't see more than a few feet into the trees. Around 10, I thought I saw movement near the edge of the clearing. Just a small, quick flash, like someone shifting behind a tree. My stomach dropped. I stared at that spot for a long time, but nothing moved again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat inside the tent with my flashlight, gripping the handle of my pocket knife, listening to the smallest sounds outside. A few times, I thought I heard something brushing against the tent fabric, but I couldn't tell if it was the wind or not. I waited for morning like that, frozen, listening, counting the hours. When dawn came, I stepped out and looked around again. There were more footprints now, dozens of them. They were scattered all around my tent, overlapping each other in the soft dirt, as if several people had been walking around me while I slept, or maybe just one person circling over and over. I packed up as fast as I could. I didn't even eat. I just threw everything in the car and drove off, barely checking to make sure the fire was out. When I got back to the main road, I stopped and looked back once. The forest behind me looked calm, still, like nothing had happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. How close they had been, how quiet that person had moved, how I hadn't heard them until they were right outside my tent. A few days later, I read an online article about a missing camper reported in that same area. It said someone found his campsite abandoned, tent torn down, gear scattered. The last time anyone had seen him was around the same weekend I'd been there. I never went back to that place again. Even now, when I think about it, I can still picture those boot prints circling my tent in the dirt, perfect and fresh, as if someone had spent the whole night watching me sleep, waiting for something I'll never understand. I went camping alone one weekend in late September, right before the cold started to creep in. The place I went to was a few hours north, deep in the woods, far from any town or main road. It wasn't an official campsite, just a clearing I had found a few years ago while exploring. It was quiet, surrounded by thick trees, and not many people knew about it. I liked the kind of silence you get there. No engines, no talking, no phone service. Just wind, insects, and the sound of leaves brushing against each other. That day, I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive had taken longer than I planned because a section of the dirt road was washed out and I had to park the truck farther down and walk the rest of the way. I was sweating by the time I got there, carrying my backpack, sleeping bag, small tent, and a few other things I'd need. The clearing looked the same as always, flat ground, tall trees all around, and a small dip nearby that led to a creek. I set up my tent near the tree line, got a fire pit ready with dry wood, and settled down. By the time I finished, the sun was already slipping behind the trees. The temperature dropped fast, and I could see the faint orange glow of the sky fading into gray. I made myself something simple to eat. I remember thinking how quiet everything felt. It wasn't an uncomfortable kind of quiet, just very still. Even the usual sound of birds was fading as night came. After I ate, I sat near the fire for a long time, staring at the flames. I kept hearing little cracks in the woods, but I told myself it was animals, maybe raccoons or squirrels. Every now and then I'd shine my flashlight out into the trees, but all I could see was the beam hitting trunks and vanishing into darkness. When it got late, I decided to call it a night. I put out most of the fire, leaving some coals glowing, and crawled into my tent. I zipped it shut, laid back on my sleeping bag, and listened to the faint night noises. It didn't take long before I started hearing something moving outside. Slow, steady rustling. It wasn't close at first, it sounded maybe 50 feet away, moving between trees. I tried to ignore it. It was probably a deer or something rooting around, but it didn't move off. It stopped for a bit, then started again, and I could tell it was circling around the area. The sound would go from one side to another, then pause. After a while, it stopped completely. I tried to calm myself down. I told myself there was nothing to worry about, but then I heard it again, closer this time. Slow steps, crunching twigs. I held my breath and turned my flashlight on inside the tent. The thin fabric glowed orange, and I saw the shadow of something move across one side. My heart started pounding. It wasn't a clear shape, just a faint blur, like someone or something walking just outside the light. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. It stayed out there for maybe 10 minutes. Then the sounds faded away into the woods. I waited a long time, listening hard, before I finally turned the flashlight off. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept waking up, checking the zipper, hearing little noises here and there, but nothing else came close. When I got up in the morning, everything looked normal again. The sun was out, the air was cold, and there was no sign of anything strange. I walked around the camp, checked the trees, looked for tracks. I found a few boot prints near the edge of the clearing. They weren't mine. They were older, half-faded, like someone had been there a day or two before. That made me uneasy. There weren't supposed to be other people around here. I thought maybe someone had been hunting or hiking nearby. I tried not to think about it too much. I spent the day hiking around, exploring a bit farther than usual. The woods were dense, but there were trails made by animals, and I followed one that went along the creek. I didn't see anyone, but at one point I thought I heard something metallic, like a distant clang, faint but sharp. I stopped and listened. It didn't happen again, so I kept walking. When I got back to camp later that evening, I noticed something odd. My backpack was slightly open. I knew I'd zipped it shut in the morning. Nothing was missing, but the zipper was half undone. Maybe I had forgotten, maybe not. That night, I made the fire bigger. I didn't want to sit in the dark again. The sky was clear and filled with stars. The air was colder than the night before. I could see my breath. Around midnight, I was just sitting there, poking at the fire with a stick, when I heard the same sound again. Footsteps. This time, there was no mistaking it. Slow, careful steps just beyond the light. I froze, staring into the black tree line. My heart was racing again. I turned my flashlight toward the sound, but it didn't catch anything. The light just disappeared into the dark. The steps stopped. I waited. Then, from the other side of the clearing, I heard another crunch. Something or someone was moving around me again. I stood up and gripped the flashlight tight. The noise stopped for a few seconds. Then I heard something brush against one of the trees. Then another soft step closer. I could feel the hairs on my neck rise. I backed up slowly toward the tent, keeping the flashlight aimed into the woods. My fire was still burning, but the edges of the clearing were swallowed in darkness. I could tell something was out there. Not an animal, it was too deliberate, too quiet and slow. Then I saw it, just for a second. A figure between two trees. It wasn't a clear look, just the outline of someone tall, standing still. No light reflecting off eyes, no movement, just standing there. I kept the light on that spot, not moving. My breathing was loud in my ears. After a few seconds, the figure stepped back and vanished into the dark. I didn't move for a long time after that. I waited until my fire burned down low. Then I finally crawled into the tent and locked the zipper all the way up. I held my flashlight in my hand the whole night. I didn't sleep at all. In the morning, I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking while I rolled up the tent. I just wanted to get out of there. When I looked around one last time, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. Near the fire pit, pressed into the dirt, were fresh footprints. They were clearer than the ones I saw before. Boot prints, adult size, and they led from the trees right up to where I had been sitting by the fire. They stopped a few feet from where my chair had been. Whoever it was had been standing there, watching me. Then they turned back into the woods. I didn't bother to follow the prints. I just grabbed my things and started walking back toward my truck. The whole way I kept checking behind me, expecting to see someone on the trail. I didn't, but I could feel it, that heavy sense that I wasn't alone. When I finally got to my truck, I threw everything in the back and drove off fast. I didn't even look in the mirror until I was halfway down the road. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still don't know who was out there. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living off the grid, maybe just someone who liked watching people. But what scares me most isn't that they were there. It's that they were close enough to reach out and touch me if they wanted to, and I would have never known until it was too late.